G'day, mate. Luke Ford here. I'm with CV, who's doing a PhD in genetics. She organizes debates at her university. She was on the panel last night. We had a crazy, wild discussion last night, and you were targeted for some essay you'd written about some racist dude. What exactly were you targeted about? What was the essay you wrote? What's the story there?
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, they were just asking questions. They brought up something I wrote. I didn't really think that was targeted. And I want to clarify that my first career was in genetics, but when I went back to school, I'm getting my PhD in rhetoric, politics, and culture. So I just don't want anyone to be misled about my credentials. But yeah, the article was about a student who's a PhD, or I think he came in not with a master's, so I think he's technically a master's student, but graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. And at his previous university, he was arrested after him and his friend kind of went on this 2-month-long spree where they did things like spray paint swastikas on university property, distribute flyers that said to like gay professors that said like all faggots must die, right? Like just dumb, stupid things that obviously like in that context in and of itself is not intelligent and also just like not a kind thing to do to people, and also like carries a history of like, I don't know, maybe don't spray paint swastikas for a whole other set of like historically backed reasons. But so anyway, at our university, his presence here alone was not the problem. The problem to me was that he was in front of and teaching students that included Jewish students, right, racially diverse students, and those students felt kind of just uncomfortable. We didn't know all this before I wrote the article, which I then, after a student came to me and kind of said, like, I can't put my finger on it, but there's just something about this class that's making me uncomfortable. So after I did a little bit of research into the person they were talking about, and I found all these things, it was like, oh, maybe the person tweeting Hitler did nothing wrong. I think I see why maybe you're having weird interactions with this person. And so, yeah, brought it to the university's attention, said I didn't think he should be teaching people while also tweeting in praise of Hitler, right? Like you shouldn't then turn around and teach Jewish students because you may not be unbiased enough to do that. Some people think that this was the wrong decision. I think those people are just incorrect, just wrong.
So where did you publish this article somewhere?
Yeah, so I wrote up a thing. I mean, I literally like stayed up one night, one shot, published it at like 8 in the morning, just like on Medium. That's the site I used to blog, and so that's where I put it.
And what was the reaction to your article?
So I had a couple of conversations with different people in the university. So some of those were like diversity workers, I think is like the official title, or at least a shared title across universities. And to some other people in the university, I was pretty explicit that I didn't think this person should be let go is the wrong word, but shouldn't, be expelled from the university. We have a lot of different ideological positions. I think for the most part, as an institution, we're responsible for the cultivation of responsible ideologies. And so, I kind of said like this person shouldn't be teaching, but that is what I think.
Wait, we suddenly lost you. Suddenly can't. Oh, yeah. I lost you. Yeah. Okay, you're back. Okay, so what happened to the guy? What did he do?
So he's now in a research position instead of a teaching position. Same pay, same hours of responsibility, same tuition remit. Everything is the same, except instead of teaching kids and interacting face to face, he's doing laboratory work towards his degree degree progress. There we go.
Oh, okay. What is his name?
Dylan Blyer.
Oh, Dylan Blyer. And did you ever get to talk to him?
Yeah, we talked a couple times. He said, I'm the furthest thing from a Nazi. I have some Jewish ancestry twice removed. I'm, whatever. So yeah, he tried to make a case for it. We went back and forth for a while. I think my analysis was correct.
And what is your level of training in genetics?
So my undergrad was in molecular biology, and then after that I worked for 5 years as a genetic engineer in a lab primarily dealing with soil bacteria.
Okay, and then you right now doing a master's in rhetoric?
No, so I have my master's. I'm pursuing my PhD now in rhetoric.
So your master's in rhetoric?
Yes.
Okay, and how long have you been interested in the alternative right?
I mean, I wouldn't say for years and years, because they haven't always been the alt-right, obviously. But I've always been really interested in extremism, particularly white extremism has just been, I don't know, I think ever since I left Miami, which is where I grew up, and went to college in Central Florida, it was weird. You know, it's weird seeing yourself in a different set of experiences, to see the way that people interact with you differently. And I wanted to kind of know why people feel that way, why those interactions were happening. And so it sort of became a fascination of mine. And then when I kind of left the lab to go study the way that people use science publicly in conversation and in policy argument, I don't know, I found myself gravitating to that group. I was really interested again, who was using science in all of these ways that I found fascinating.
At what year did you become strongly interested in white extremism?
When you say strongly interested, do you mean interested and also knowledgeable enough where I feel like I can speak from a place of authority? Well, I would say that's recent, right? I wouldn't have called myself anyone who can talk about these things with competence until probably the last year of my PhD coursework. So like within the last year.
Okay, so my audience are a bunch of white extremists. I mean, you've got a lot of courage coming on a show like this.
I don't know. Maybe it's courage. Maybe it's stupidity. Nobody knows, but I appreciate that.
Thanks for the invite, Luke. I was going to ask a question, if you don't mind.
Please go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, I was curious how you define, like, what is the criteria that one has to meet, or that a belief system has to meet, to be considered extremism?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of debate around political scientists and kind of communicative political comm scholars about what extremism is. I think, to me, and the definition that I use most of the time in my research, is that something is extremism only if it cannot be carried out through the political system that we currently have. Sorry, my dog just came in. I mean, I think that people would reasonably define me as an extremist, right? Like, I don't see it as a moral argument. It's more just a characterization of whether or not what you are saying can be accomplished through the normal rule of law and political process that's currently in place in the status quo.
I see. So it's effectively whether or not somebody is a revolutionary or not.
Yeah, I mean, that's an easy way to think about it.
Oh, okay. I was just curious. I don't know if I've been drinking sufficiently to get to the levels of vitriol that Mr. Grace was at last night, but I'll try and do my best. So what did I miss? What did you?
Okay, go ahead and just listen for a while, Cater, and then let me know when you have a question. Tell me, how did you begin your serious research into white extremism?
Wow. So, I mean, a lot of it was just reading forums kind of throughout college, throughout parts of grad school, and just sort of like, like reading Stormfront, reading the Daily Stormer, reading kind of Breitbart, and then the comment sections on top of it, because I don't think that Breitbart necessarily I would call extremist in and of itself. And just sort of, watching more videos, listening to more podcasts, a lot of stuff in like the Right Stuff Network, and just sort of exposing myself to ideologies that otherwise I don't personally interact with, right? Like, I don't usually have a communicative two-way dialogue with people who believe that set of things, or at least not that believe that set of things and then make it aware to me that they do.
And what surprised you as you were making this journey?
I don't know if anything was surprising necessarily. I think I've appreciated the exposure. I've appreciated a lot of the conversations I've had, and it's certainly, for me, it's a reminder of like the persistence of humanity, right? Just like we don't become less people when we disagree with each other, even if that disagreement is fierce, right? Even if someone's fundamental ideology is that they would like to see me deported and or killed, right? Like, that's a person on the other side of that. And to me, that gives me hope, right? Thinking that the person on the other side of that conversation is never completely gone, right? That there's always a way to, maybe not, I don't know, maybe there's not always a way to dialogue with someone, but I don't think that that is inherent to someone's political stance. I think it's something that on a broader level, on a systemic level, can be worked through as a society.
Now, from where I come from, I'm not alt-right, but I'm interested in the alt-right. And I virtually never get triggered by the alt-right because they have no power. So to me, it doesn't really matter if they call for, gas the Ks and lynch the Ns or anything like that, because they have no power and no capability of carrying it out. What's your perspective?
I mean, I think on a micro level, I disagree, because there are things like, shootings, in the same way that, like, you could say that ISIS doesn't have any power in the United States, but they still are capable of carrying out attacks, right? So, like, on a micro level, there's something to the idea that power isn't necessarily everything. I would say on the macro side of that, I think that as a nation, right, we're founded on a certain set of principles and a certain set of legal codifications that we haven't fully dealt with the damage from. And so systems like, for example, capitalism, well, not even capitalism, but the corporatism, right, like the neoliberal form of corporatism we currently have, that can have an influence on, that can have an ideological drive behind it that can target certain people. And I believe it does target certain people. So I agree that, like, the alt-right doesn't have the power that they think of. I think some of their ideas do. And so to me, the way that I approach my research is asking questions about the intersection of power and extremism to say, like, what assumptions does this rest on, right? Like, what specifically for me, scientific assumptions does this rest on, and how does that science get articulated in public discourse, in kind of conversations and argumentation?
Well, I almost never feel a fear in the pit of my stomach with regard to the alt-right. And for the primary reason, there haven't been any acts of violence carried out by the alt-right. The closest thing to it would be James Field driving his Charger into a crowd of Antifa. And Field was much more old-fashioned neo-Nazi than alt-right. So do you get a ball of fear in your stomach when you go to the Daily Stormer or Stormfront or any of these white nationalist websites?
I think I feel a much larger pit of fear from hanging around the everyday, totally not racist liberals in Madison, Wisconsin than I have from the alt-right.
Well, that actually raised a point in my mind that I was curious about, because I recall hearing you say last time you and I were on that you thought that the right, as you put it, had the institutional power. And I always hear that it's like, if somebody is a leftist, then they'll always say the right is always in power. And then if somebody's a rightist, they'll always say that the left is always in power. But as pertains to groups like the alt-right or groups like, paleo conservatives and whatnot, they have very, very little institutional power, like almost none at all, in comparison with the major think tanks in Washington, like CSIS, the ADL, SPLC, this gigantic conglomeration of think tanks, foundations, civil rights groups, etc. And just even when one moves out of the space of those fringe groups into more mainstream, I mean, you have to really get into like the mainstream GOP, Cato Institute type guys before you start getting any kind of institutional power on the quote unquote right.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing consistently in power is power, right? Like, it's not a left thing, it's not a right thing. It's that there are evil people who can blend themselves into any ideology. There is disproportionate power in this country that's held, in my opinion, in the hands of disproportionately few. But no, I don't think that has a political ideology attached to it. I think that it has certain ways like I said, I'm a rhetorician, so I talk about discourses and articulation and language probably like more than anyone besides my own field cares about. But it does have a particular way of kind of working its way into linguistic norms, working its way into other ideologies through that.
I think Manik had a question.
Hi, CV. Yeah, I just have two questions for you. I guess I appreciate you coming on, although we were talking after last night's show, some of us, and I mean, to be candid, I think I have some hesitation about it, like given kind of what Luke's show has been in the past. I mean, certainly you're familiar with terms like no platforming or ghosting or exiling or excommunicating.
Yeah, sure. I invite all invitations. I mean, I accept all invitations I'm given. So I think this is a critique that's more levied towards Luke than me. Like, I don't know, if I get invited to go on a show and have a conversation, I'm always going to take that option because I'm always going to want to have that conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, it is actually leveled at Luke or Brundle or whatever. But given that, I am sort of interested what you think about. I mean, it seems like, do you think that that's inevitable, that in sort of all, societies or communities, that there's going to be someone who has the power to exile others? So it might be, excuse me, it might be the right wing, the sort of traditional right wing that wants to exile the transsexuals or excommunicate them, or it might be, the social justice left that wants to exile the traditional right winger who wants to exile transsexuals. You see what I'm saying? And so, how do we decide who has the power to exile?
Well, I don't think anyone should have the power to exile. I mean, yes, you're right. There will always be injustice in the world. We'll never be able to rid ourselves of unsafety. We'll never be able to make ourselves comfortable. We live in a larger ecosystem that also is not, oriented towards our survival, just in terms of like microbes and plants, right? Like they don't care about people. And so I think, yeah, there will always be some level of power, and this is a struggle that we probably never get to stop having. And on the one hand, that's really disheartening. On the other hand, it's just reality, right? Like there's a brute reality out there, and we will fight against injustice, however you articulate it, from now until we die, or it'll take us over and we'll live in feudalism. I don't know, either or.
Yeah, I mean, I guess because I work in academia, I see the tribalism that is academia in a way that I'm not sure that like Brundle does. And so I feel very much like an exile. Like I have nobody I can talk to about this stuff in academia, because I'm like to the right of where you can be in terms of like the Overton window stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, I feel you. I'm way to the left of where I can be, and it's been a repeated issue for me throughout my academic career. And so, yeah, there is this center of power, and there is this illusion that there are two sides to it, right? Which is not to say there's no such thing between a political right and a political left. But I think in America, in terms of our mainstream parties, we have this artificial division between right and left that we fixate ourselves on. And when we do it, we don't notice that, like, this is weird. We're actually both on the outside of this institution of power, and what can that tell us about the way that power operates, right? What does it mean for us to both feel on the outside? Does it mean one of us is wrong? Does it mean we're right, but about different things? Or does it mean that there is something fundamental to the way that power operates, that it thrives on exclusion and conflict? And I think it's that last one.
Yeah, I will think more about this. Seems like a rabbit hole I don't want to go down. Let me ask you one more question, and then I got to go for dinner here. But about the gender politics and gender sexuality stuff, this is a question that's sort of earnest from me, that I'm actually interested in it. I mean, it's an interesting topic to me. I've been out of grad school for 15 years, and this wasn't my stuff. So forgive me if I'm stumbling over the terminology, but the question is this: if identity is not a kind of biological given, and it can be, disconnected from the body, or it isn't determined by the genes exactly, then why is it, or maybe you could tell me it isn't, still mediated by gender terminology? Like, why do we talk about it in terms of male, female at all? Like, why not? Did you see what I'm asking? Why not identify as a praying mantis or a pumpkin?
Yeah, fair. And I mean, I guess someone could do those things, although I wouldn't really understand why they would. To answer your question as to why we talk about it in terms of male and female, I think it's because we live in a society that places an extremely high value on a reproductive nuclear household. And so obviously that language developed before we had a conception of genetics, right? And that language developed out of a very real social need to reproduce, especially if you look at kind of before we had kind of like a modern civilization, right? Reproduction was even more important when humans were at a much higher risk of dying all the time, which is why it's still important in a lot of places and why some countries have to have restrictions on that. And so I think that the reason why it developed that way is because of, and it's a social importance, it's a religious importance, it's an economic importance. We really coalesce around the idea of reproduction as a societal function being very, very important, and our language reflects that.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, to me, it seems, first of all, it seems symptomatic. I feel the same way about gender dysphoria as I do about like addictive behavior or gluttony or something. And so it seems symptomatic to me of a more disordered civilization. And so, in other words, I'm not blaming the individual as much as like sort of seeing this thing happen. My last question is like, why do you think it happened? Because it does seem to come in these waves, right? Like we've seen the ancient world in Greece, we saw it in China. There's sort of eunuchs that occasionally pop up in various, late empires, it seems to be. And what's your take on why this happens sometimes?
I mean, I think it's a historical constant. I can't think of a time where there were not people who, and they obviously wouldn't have identified as transgender. They would identify as some other word that basically means the same thing, which is to take lines of flight, right? In terms of your, maybe how you identify in language, but maybe just in terms of like your aesthetic, how you dress, how you perform what are thought of as traditionally gendered roles, right? Like lines of flight away from what your body means in terms of those social responsibilities that you might have. You always see that. And I think the reason why is because with any system, there are exceptions to it. And it's really that simple, right? There are biological exceptions. We can see them in brain scans. We can see them in intersex people. We can see them in kind of chromosomal swap over, which is when some X chromosomes will perform like Y chromosomes, even though they're X chromosomes. Ostensibly, they don't act that way. And so you get a child that grows a penis, et cetera, et cetera. And there are places in the world where this happens, like at puberty. There are just a lot of exceptions. And sometimes those cluster together and sometimes those don't.
Thank you for answering my questions.
Absolutely.
I have some questions. You said that nothing surprised you in your research on the alt-right and white extremism. Who would you say are the most important thinkers, most important intellectuals in white extremism?
Oh gosh, that's like such a hotly contested and debated idea. So my research focuses not on the alt-right, right, or on the extremist groups themselves. I focus on what I call kind of like information launderers, so people who sit in the middle of traditional politics and civil society and what we might think of as extremism. So an example of that would be something like the Proud Boys, right? They are most certainly, by their own definition, many times said over, not alt-right. Well, why does the discourse look so similar? And what kinds of gaps in language do groups like the Proud Boys bridge in terms of, something like to give you an example of a podcast I was on, the Southern AF podcast in the Right Stuff Network. Why do I see so much of the same language there as I see in institutional politics, as I see in a group like the Proud Boys? And so I'm interested in those pathways of information, if that makes sense. And so most of the stuff I listen to comes at recommendations from people I've interviewed. So stuff like, everything from people who aren't alt-right, like Peterson and Shapiro and Charles Murray, to people who are, like JF and like Worski, right? People who, I don't know. And again, the identification, right? You might not call someone like Worski alt-right necessarily. So I think that like the labels that people use are a little bit less important, and it's more about the trajectories of conversations and information. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I still want to push you. I'd really like an answer, or if you don't have an answer, then just say I don't have an answer. I assume you've read some of the most important thinkers in white extremism. I'm assuming you've read some Jared Taylor. I'm assuming you've read some William Pierce. I'm assuming you've read Mein Kampf. I'm assuming that you've read Richard Spencer. I'm assuming that you've read Greg Johnson.
Yeah, my prelims list, which is like when you're going through your PhD process, you put these like long reading lists together of things that you need to read. And oh my God, yeah, my prelims list, when I turned it into my advisor, the public discourse section was very much that and I haven't gotten to Jared Taylor's book yet, but definitely a lot of Richard Spencer in there. And I don't know, a lot of podcasts, to be frank, because I don't think people are reading books like they used to. There are some classics, like Evola's book, right, Revolt Against the Modern World. So yeah, I try to get a good mix in, but then I try to also not get distracted by the fact that there are so many different changing figureheads, right, and people who follow personalities and not movements. I try not to get too trapped in that, and so I try to look for things that kind of like discrete groups put out, like, Identity Europa, for example.
Yeah, but I got to ask the same question again. Who are the most important thinkers in white extremism?
Like I said, I can only tell you people I've listened to. I can't tell you what people think is the most important or influential.
No, who do you? I'm just asking you, from what you've read, who are the most important thinkers from what you're aware of in white extremism?
Yeah, I know you want me to answer this question, and I'm not sure if it's like a fact check or if it's a you know, because you're curious as to what I think, but I don't think that that kind of unity exists. The more I talk to people, the more I see them looking at different people, right? Like right now, I hear a lot of people tell me about JF and about alt hypothesis, right? Like I hear a lot of those names and I watch those things because those are the research participants I'm interacting with. But I don't think I could make a claim, and I don't think that a very persuasive claim could be made about single people as intellectual leaders.
Wow.
Well,
So, sorry, one last question. So have you read William Pierce?
What's that? I'm sorry.
Have you read William Pierce?
No, I have not.
Okay, okay, I'm done on this angle. Cater, go ahead.
Yeah, I've read William Pierce. A strange man, interesting man, but a very strange man. But what I was going to say was I rather object to this continual reference to extremism. You know, like that's one of the things. Yeah, that's one of the things that motivated me to begin talking about politics was the incredible laxity with which people use these descriptive terms. Like I heard people referring years ago to Sam Harris, of all people, as an extremist. And I heard all this stuff back before I knew much about him. They were saying he wanted to glass Gaza and all kinds of crazy nonsense. And I look up what he says. He doesn't say any of that. So it's all lies. But there's still people that refer to him today, like Glenn Greenwald still refers to him as an extremist. You know, people refer to Jared Taylor and even Richard Spencer as an extremist. I don't find them, you know, I'm sure lots of people find their views to be non-concurrent with the mainstream of society, but they're not extremists in that they're terrorists or they're advocating for the murder of X groups of people. So I find that all rather tiresome. It's just not true.
Maybe, again, I'm not the one who brought that word into it, and you can look through my research. You will not find the word extremism.
No, I didn't say you did.
No, I know.
It's constantly being pumped out by everybody who talks about such people. And it's just so manifestly untrue, and it almost always goes uncorrected. Like people will just say phrases like extremist and white supremacist, and then everybody will just nod and be like, yes, that's true. And it's just not true.
Yeah, so because CV defined extremism or extremists as people whose aims can't be accomplished within the political system. I mean, CV, would you consider the alt-right extremists under this definition?
I mean, it depends on what the individual person is calling for, but largely no, I wouldn't.
Yeah, because like I think of, you know, one of the major things that people on the alt-right want is the deportation of illegal immigrants. No matter how many there are within current law, we're fully justified in throwing all 30 million of them out. You know, and frankly, like we're just a couple of court decisions away from, you know, getting whatever kind of laws or whatever kind of status quo we want in this country. I mean, if they can read into the Constitution a right to gay marriage, I mean, almost anything's possible within the rule of law.
Sure, yeah. Like I said, I don't view it as extremism, and it is largely for that reason. This can be very easily carried out through the political systems that we have in place.
Can I ask something? Hi, excuse me. I like your definition of extremism. It means you can't achieve your goals in the current political system. I think that's, you know, that means then, of course, you would accept that 10 years ago, the trans movement was extreme. Certainly had no means, say 20 years ago, there was no real route at the time for you to achieve your goals politically, right?
I mean, I would disagree in the sense that, like, if you mean the mainstream trans movement that's concerned with, like, not being banned from the military or changing their passport gender, right? Like, which aren't things that I particularly think are good goals.
Gay marriage 20 years ago.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's extreme.
Most any
because
mainstream politician considered it an extreme, and they reassured us conservatives at the time that it's not going to go that far. Was one thing that a very liberal politician would have typically said, say around the early 90s, you know?
Yeah, it turned out that they were incorrect, that this was something achievable through the political process. Although if you count like civil disobedience kind of as a type of extremism, I mean, at that point, I think the word means almost nothing. But yeah, I mean, if you
isn't that where we kind of are in the alt-right in a sense, a lot of our civil disobedience, because as the point Brundle was making, I think was that it's kind of an outrage that our views, which are legal, you know, like you could legally deport all illegal aliens tomorrow, supposedly under the laws of the United States. It wouldn't be an extreme abuse of law, right? Yet it's considered an extreme view somehow. So we're in that situation, yet we can't even really, we have a little freedom of assembly to protest it, right?
Yeah, I mean, you would characterize
we have this remarkable character in Trump, whatever you think of him, and I admit he's crazy. But, you know, even with him electing him, we made this astounding statement. We wanted that wall, really, you know, and because a lot of us kind of recognize he's sort of a loose cannon, to say the least, you know, yet still we can't achieve our goals.
Yeah,
it's remarkable. Sorry.
No,
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I'm particularly interested, if you are very much concerned with extremism, why not pay attention to Antifa, which under your definition is probably the only extreme group, political group in America that I can think of. I mean, they instigate street violence. I mean,
so as previously said, I don't view extremism as a moral category, and then this might have been before you joined the chat. But I think there are plenty of people who would consider me an extremist, right? And so I don't think of it as something that you should necessarily trust the way that the public labels people accordingly. I don't think extremism is necessarily a bad thing at all. So, I mean, I guess I could focus on Antifa, but that's not what I researched.
Well, I guess what I was saying is that under your definition of extremism, they're the only group I can think of that would meet it. So why not study them?
Well, I think the issue is what we mean by achieving your political means. So, for example, if by achieving your political means you mean deporting everyone tomorrow, yeah, that would probably be, according to this definition, extremist for the reasons that Dennis was just saying, right? Like, it is unlikely in the current political climate that tomorrow we will begin the deportation. Well, actually, we kind of are, but that it would be completed by tomorrow, right? Like, that's not going to happen. The wall getting built tomorrow, not going to happen. And so in some ways you can think of those as extremist positions because of the likelihood that they occur. But I think that our political positions aren't really staked out in terms of these small actions, right? Like no one's whole politic is, I want a wall on the southern border, right? They want a wall on the southern border because they're concerned about accomplishing a particular goal, right? I want to keep undocumented people out, or I want to keep specifically Mexican people from crossing the border, right? Which is why we don't build a border on the top wall, because we see, you know, that's where we view the threat is coming from. And so I think if you think about it only in terms of like, well, we want gay marriage, right? Well, we want these small actions to happen. And I think that we are encouraged to think in those short-term ways. And I think that really hurts us, and it stops us from thinking openly and genuinely about bigger political questions that are much more important. So when I talk about extremism, I don't usually view people's most immediate political goals as the markers of their ideology. I try to look for rhetoric that more specifically explains the ideology that kind of informs that, right? The justifications for those actions, and to tease out something a little bit bigger.
But see, you're shifting the goalposts, because before you said that extremism was based on taking positions or accomplishing goals that were outside the current rule of law. Deporting everybody tomorrow, while maybe not practically feasible, is perfectly legal and in fact required under the law.
Yeah, I'm trying to split the difference between, I think, the really important nuance that Dennis is adding in terms of like, well, what if it's this action can't be done? And so what I'm trying to say is that when I talk, I mean, and again, I don't use the word extremism very much, I don't think at all so far in my research. But if I were to use it, right, or when I do talk about, or I guess maybe it's the reason I don't use it, right, is because I tend to gravitate towards ideologies and discourses of ideologies, and not discourses of, is this one action extreme or not? And so, yeah, you're right, that what I did was shift the goalpost. I was hoping to make it clear that that was responding to what I thought was a really good and interesting point, and not just like me arbitrarily deciding to talk about something else.
Sorry, can Babs mute? Sorry, guys.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I didn't realize my microphone was on the whole time.
Well, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. I just have a quick question, Stevie. Earlier in the conversation, you sort of laid out, I don't remember exactly what you said, but you said something to the effect of, we're going to keep fighting for justice, and then it is sort of in juxtaposition with, quote, justice, you laid out the sort of this alternative, which you described as feudalism. So to end quote, or quote, justice and quote, feudalism, as I conceive it, are two things that are not necessarily incongruous. I just, I guess, when you say justice, are you talking about, let's say, like equality, or what about, quote, feudalism seems unjust to you, or even better, what is your vision of justice, as it were? What does justice look like to you in the modern context, in any context?
You still might question it.
So the justice to me is a set, I mean, it's people, and I use this definition a lot, being able to give people what they need without them having to beg. To me, that's what a just society orients itself towards. And it really is that simple, right? Meeting people's needs. I don't view feudalism as a particularly successful way to meet people's needs without them having to beg, because I don't think that structures that mandate a certain way of living and or that categorize people before they are born with a predestined kind of like life path, right? And we can argue about whether or not feudalism does or doesn't do that in historical context. But to me, that's what makes, in that analogy or in that binary that I gave you, which is obviously not a real binary, right? That feudalism, in my opinion, is not a just system when it fails to meet people's needs without them having to beg.
Okay, I'm going to weigh back in. So at the beginning of the interview, I tried to ask you about the alt-right, and you said the alt-right wasn't the focus of your research. The focus of your research was white extremism. So then I tried to ask you about who are the leading thinkers of white extremism, and then you said, I don't talk about white extremism. So you don't like the label alt-right, you don't like the label white extremism. So what terminology do you use for the dissident right, the right wing that's outside of conservatism?
I mean, first of all, those were not words I used. Those were kind of the ways that you introduced my research. So yes, I would agree. There's some like not super compatibility, and I like to do my best to like explain things in the language that other people use, because I think that's the best way for us to understand each other. But I see in this case, it ended up producing more confusion. So I apologize for that. And I also will say part of this is like going through my prelims and being at the stage where I'm about to propose my dissertation. Ooh, it's a hard time to pin down what you research, because this is that formational stage where I'm like reading all the things and trying to figure out exactly what it is that I want to research. But I would say, to answer your question, is yes, I don't use terms like the alt-right, and I don't use terms like extremism, because I don't think I focus on the alt-right, nor do I view them as extreme. What I do focus on are specifically discourses of white supremacy, which is not the same thing as white nationalism or white identitarianism. And the thing that distinguishes white supremacy for me is the explicit belief, not that white people are biologically different, but that they are superior as a result of their whiteness.
Okay, and could you name a white supremacist?
Sure, I would name Richard Spencer as an example, and I'm happy to have that argument.
Great. So where has Richard Spencer ever said that white people are superior on the basis of their whiteness?
So one example would be that Richard Spencer believes deeply in a society that is oriented around monogamy and reproductivity. His belief is that white people invented the idea of monogamy, which is absurd and ridiculous. Now, one of the things that we can read into these sorts of assertions about how white civilization is not only genetic, but also grounded in land and also superior, right? Like if you combine those three things and you combine them with an impulse to secure a certain amount of land that is tied genetically to white people by virtue of the superior types of civilizations they allegedly create, right? You put all that together, you have an ideology that thinks white people are superior to others.
In some ways, but Richard Spencer would tell you lots of ways where East Asians are superior to whites, where blacks are superior to whites, where Jews are superior to whites. So if Richard Spencer thinks that there are some ways that white civilization is superior to other civilizations, but that there are other ways where black, Jewish, East Asian civilizations are superior to white civilization. Why is that white supremacist? You'll say we're good at one thing, other peoples are good at other things. Is the idea
if you think that Richard Spencer believes that black and white people have equal amounts of moral authority, equal amounts of kind of just like value to life, equal amounts of I don't know, measure before a divine being, then I would say that he is an exceptionally good snake oil salesman and you are getting sold very effectively.
Okay, well, so Richard Spencer, wait, no, I've got to finish this. So Richard Spencer's an atheist. He's like very clearly publicly an atheist. So the idea of appealing to a divine being there just was absurd. Second, Richard Spencer would tell you that in average IQ, that Ashkenazi Jews are superior to whites and that East Asians are superior to whites. Richard Spencer would be happy to tell you that blacks have special gifts in areas where they excel all other races, such as in spontaneity, in improvisation, in some forms of stand-up, in some forms of sporting and performing arts expertise. So if he could list a whole series, which I know he could, where blacks are superior to all other races, where he could list areas where East Asians are superior to all other races, where he could list important parts of life where Ashkenazi Jews are superior to all other races, you know, it seems weird, it seems incongruous, weird to say that he's a white supremacist when he recognizes that different peoples have different gifts.
Two things. First is that whether or not someone identifies as an atheist is not the point, right? There can still be spiritual elements, and this is something that political communication scholars will call magical thinking, right? The idea that we tend to adopt these supernatural understandings of the world very often, right? And it's a way for us to process information, things beyond ourselves that are often bigger than what we can understand. So the first thing I would say is that just because someone is an atheist does not mean that they are not someone who engages in that kind of divinity-based cognitive processes, because that's something we all do as humans. It's what our brains do. The second thing I would say is that if you look to something like IQ science to establish the inferiority or superiority of other races, you've already kind of bought into some of the mythos, right? You've already bought into not only mythos that is driven by a very large corporate backing, not only in terms of IQ, but things like ancestry, right? Like DNA testing that tells you or purports to tell you where you are from, that those sorts of things are incredibly driven by a market demand, right? And one that corrupts information. Market demand almost always corrupts information. You think about think tanks that are driven by donors, right? Like you could see this on any side of the political spectrum, that when money is involved in the production of information, it corrupts that information according to what people kind of want to see, because people want to pay for the things they want. They don't want to pay for a disappointment most of the time. And so the idea that we can categorize ourselves based on IQ, based on genetics, and that IQ and race have a relationship, like these are tired arguments. And these are the arguments that mostly I concern my research with, right? These understandings of science that have no basis in reality. And I'm interested in how people get manipulated by them and then convey those sentiments through ideology that they say is backed by evidence.
I mean, if people have differently shaped brains, and you know, everyone from their head to every other facet of their body evolved in completely different environments. I just think it's patently absurd, and you'd have to prove otherwise to say that everyone's brain and the manner in which they comprehend and process reality is exactly the same. If you're looking at even the two brains physically, if you take a brain from a person who's evolved on one side of the world, then take a brain from a person who's evolved on the other side of the world in a completely different environment, a completely different context, and take into account all the genetic drift and other factors that have been at play here. And the brains will physically look different. I can't possibly imagine how two brains that physically look different will be able to process reality in an identical manner.
Yeah, we're such a physical species, you know, or such a visual species. It's interesting to me the way that people often will say, like, but these things look different, right? Like their brains look different. How could they possibly not? No,
there are different amounts of brain matter, and I mean, don't. That's absolutely silly.
Well, I could
there's
answer
actually
your question, but only if you stop yelling over me.
I mean, I'm hardly yelling, but please spew your nonsense by all means. Go ahead. I'm not saying. I mean, I'm making a very basic argument. I could make a more complex argument for the exact same thing, but sure, address this one.
Sure. So again, things looking differently isn't actually an indicator that they are different, and are different obviously visually, right? But it's like, what do we take that to mean? So for example, yes, people have different heights, different sizes, right? Like different exists. That's obviously true. The idea, though, that people can be categorized into racial subgroups in humans is not only biologically incorrect, right? There is a biological definition of race that humans do not need, but it's also true that the differences that we have decided to invest meaning into, that those were created, those biological differences were created after we had already decided on that as a political reality. And that process was formed through very overtly, right, like nationalistic policies where race was not a factor, right? We didn't pretend that there were these biological differences. We hashed things out in wars, in colonization, through trade, right? But we didn't pretend that there was something biologically different between people. We did that when we could kind of like find science that we could shoehorn into those things, right? And there's a set of people responsible for creating, right, those lineages of information. But yes, like you're right, people look different. There are biological differences between people.
No, I'm not talking about how people look different. I'm talking about brains looking different, because let's say if we know, oh, this part of the brain having a bigger this part of the brain equals this type of thing, you know, within populations or across populations, then you see what I'm saying here. You're kind of misrepresenting my argument here when I was talking about the way that a brain looks.
Why don't you give me an example, since you seem to feel very confidently about this, why don't you give me an example of a place in the brain that is different between races?
I know so little about the brain. Different amounts of gray matter, different sized brain size, for instance. Brain size, I've seen studies that show that brain size seems to correlate with certain types of, I think, certain types of visual memorization, if I recall correctly. And this seems to play out when you look at types of visual memorization tests that have been given to groups that have, even the group, even though they might have a lower, quote, IQ overall, the groups that have larger brains generally seem to do better on tests that, I mean, it'll take me a while to pull up this information, but people can just look this up. It's pretty easily available
that
stuff.
Trend holds true across all races, right? Like, it turns out that our brains aren't actually that variable. And it's not that you don't know a lot about the brain, it's that we don't know a lot about the brain, right? Like, we know very, very little about how the brain works. And phrenology, which is like something we moved so far beyond as scientists, right? Because we started to figure. I mean,
yeah, this isn't phrenology.
No, the shape of the
brain. No. When I was talking about the shape of the brain, I wasn't talking about phrenology. I was just making like a really basic, stupid argument. I mean,
we know. Can I just say they're finding that it was never a myth that brain size is not correlated with intelligence. It is. And they're finding that
certain types of intelligence, certain types of visual memorization intelligence, indeed.
And it varies by individuals. You can even look at the prefrontal cortex, and a greater amount of folds in the front of your brain indicates a smarter person. Now, I'm no expert.
Oh, I'm sorry, Dennis. I thought you were done.
Suggesting that, and it varies from individual to individual. Now, if there's any validity to call them races, call them population groups, call them blood groups, whatever you want, to any two given groups, and within those two groups, there's individual variation between intelligence, and they've sort of bred for 40,000 years or more separately, wouldn't there then be variation from group to group in general intelligence and all these behaviors associated with it? Sorry.
I think if the world looked the way it did now, and also you assumed that like people didn't move from where they were for 40,000 years, then like, yeah, you would probably expect to see some differences. I would say that brains are a little bit different, and there's kind of two important things to touch on here. The first is that, you know, as a species, we're not even 40,000 years old, or if we are, it's like we've just hit it. And so to an extent, like, that would be the entire development of human history. And yes, there are definitely changes that have happened, and those changes are obviously going to be to some degree geologically clustered, because that's how reproduction works.
I mean, if we don't speak of race, we speak of what acceptable would you use? I mean, you know, you're.
Well, let me get
which
there.
You're proud, right? Sorry.
Yeah, sure. And obviously, I wouldn't say that like you shouldn't have pride in those things, right? You shouldn't have pride in your ethnic group. I'd never say that. You should be totally proud of your ethnic group. I'm like mad proud of being Italian, for example, right? Like, I don't think you will miss me saying that very much.
I like that.
Right. I imagined you would. My point isn't like that there aren't differences in terms of like where mutations popped up geographically, right? And that you can definitely say like, oh, look at how this mutation tends to occur more in this place. Sickle cell anemia, easy example. But the brain is really complex and is much slower to evolve than I think we give it credit for. And there's a few biological reasons for that. The first is like, you know, you have how many neurons and they all make connections and different sizes of different parts of the brain, right? Like different gray matter, white matter. That does
You mentioned
impact.
sickle cell. What about Asperger's? I think it's prevalent in high IQ Jews, right? It kind of piggybacks on the gene that is associated with high IQ.
I have not seen anything to suggest that that is true. I don't know.
The result of an anti-malarial adaptation for Black people, sub-Saharan Black folks. Similarly,
right, and so there are geographically driven mutations for sure. And sickle cell, I mean to give that as an example of exactly the kind of thing you're talking about.
I just think you said shoehorn earlier, and I thought it wasn't fair shoehorning supposedly scientific racism into science. And I think,
well, I'll give you an example of why that's true real quick, and I'll use sickle cell anemia as an example. So yes, it's true that once you say what kind of things are disproportionately high among Black people, that if you test those people, you can definitely identify that, right? Like if you already know the group ahead of time, you can look at that group and you can say, what is more prevalent here? And so if you look at a continent like Africa, you can say, well, sickle cell is more prevalent here than it is elsewhere, but it's not prevalent among all people, right? Like most people do not have the sickle cell gene because it's fatal, right, when you get two of them. Sure. And so yes, that's something that's more frequent where malaria is present, but it's also something that the majority of people living in Africa do not have. And a large majority of people living in Africa do not have that gene. And so, yeah, there are obviously differences between people. That's not, in my opinion.
And of course you would concede we're not talking about everybody in this group versus everybody in that group. There's overlap and there's, you know, everything else. It's just, what you said about Spencer, though, I think what defines him as an extremist, I think, would that define a similarly situated Jewish person feeling the same way about his Jewishness, an Italian, a Black person, anybody else? Would that make them in the same sense a supremacist?
I don't really care who you are, what your identity is. If you believe that your people are intrinsically better than other people, then yeah, that makes you a supremacist.
What if it's demonstrable what one is claiming to be superior at?
Give me an example.
Well, so like there's many people that will point to various different crime statistics, and they'll show racial disparities in crime. And there's many different explanations for that. But if you want to say, like if an individual says that X particular group is more law-abiding in one particular structure, one particular country, and then they can show it, would you consider that to be supremacist?
No, I think if you say here is a demonstrable trend and you can. Oops, sorry, I muted myself. I imagine that we could each identify very separate reasons why that's true for any given population, right? But yes, if you could identify something, it could be demonstrable. Like, for example, serial killers are a decent example of this, right? It's like there's been this hunt that if we can find the key, right, like the gene that makes pathological murderers pathological, then we can test people for that and we'll know it because we'll see the genetic proof there. And so we'll know people are more likely to commit these crimes. We can respond to them as a society more effectively. So like, yes, there are things like that that exist that to me are slippery slopes for sure, because like, I don't think any of us want the government like genetically testing all of us to find out for serial killers. But yeah, absolutely. Those things matter.
I mean, the thing is though, is like, there's never going to be like a monogenic like murderer gene. And I mean, I brought up like, oh, brains look different earlier. That was like, yeah, that's a dumb example. And I can see why you thought I was talking about phrenology there earlier, but it was deliberately, you know, I was trying to keep things simple, but we can also talk about like how Ian Deary and like plenty of other researchers have found that within populations that evolve together, there are like differences in like, I guess, like bunchings or kind of like rubrics of genes, I guess, as it were, that sort of correlate with like certain traits, like let's say certain types of either things that lead to or what can be perceived as, quote, things that correlate with certain types of intelligence or G or whatever, something like that. And then between populations, they take this thing, they look at it within populations, and they apply it to between populations that evolve differently. And if to the extent that, quote, race or, quote, population grouping or clustering or evolutionary group or whatever you want to call it can be used as a heuristic, I think that it is valid to talk about things like, let's say, race and intelligence differences, even though like I don't really enjoy talking about things like this, because at the end of the day, you know, it's like we're talking about averages, and it's not like a very nice thing to talk about, you know, as people were saying in this call earlier, you know, every
every group, not only does every group have their gifts, but every group, I guess, has intellectual gifts even within that. So I don't really, but I want to go back to something that was being talked about earlier. Then that was the concept of, I guess, Richard Spencer being a white supremacist or something like that, as I see it. And the thing that's interesting for me, I guess the way that I see it is, to everyone for most of history, everyone was, to a degree, something of a supremacist for their group, with a bit of an, I think, a bit of a at least subconscious understanding in the back of their mind that their group wasn't, the only path. Their group was simply, I guess, as it were, or their way of life was the best path for them and for their group, and that their group was the best to them. For instance, you would have the ancient, like you'd have the Athenians and the Spartans, and they both thought, their god was the best for them and the best path of life for them, but they didn't necessarily seek to extrapolate that and then go and say, oh, so therefore we must, spread the good word of Athena or something like that. And even similarly, the ancient Egyptians would refer to themselves as the race of man. Now, I just want to give you a little bit of context of where I'm coming from. I'm like a Jew. I'm like a Middle Eastern guy. I'm not an impartial observer, but I'm pretty much an observer to this whole like white people identity movement thing, I guess, that's going on, however you want to describe it. But I guess the way that I see it is it's like the healthy natural worldview and the state of being for most people in terms of group thinking and group identity is basically a common, everyone will kind of to a degree think that their group is the best, but there will also be kind of an understanding and that their way of life that is for their group, that their group has naturally kind of evolved to create, is the best for them, but also kind of a shared understanding that other ways of life may be best for other groups. It's sort of a perennialism of the cultures, if you see what I'm getting at. And that's why I wouldn't necessarily consider Richard Spencer any more of, let's say, a European descent people supremacist than the ancient Egyptians, calling, the ancient Egyptians like the supreme originating race of man.
Okay, Badge,
any sort of Egyptian supremacist.
You're repeating. So, CV.
That was all.
Yeah. So again, I think this is where my training as a rhetorician really benefits me in looking at this kind of issue specifically. So like, yes, you're right. Supremacy, especially nationalism as a form of supremacy, always very prevalent. The difference between what, say, the Egyptians did is that to them, it wasn't about like some kind of inherent or biological, right? Like it wasn't an inherent property. And so I think it's worth it to draw the differences between, for example, the Roman Empire, right, that colonized people, but then integrated them into the body of citizens, right? And so Roman people had a supremacy about them, especially during the years of empire, but it wasn't about their Romanness as a function of where they were born, who their parents were, right? It was a faction of their shared history with Italianness. Another good example would be someone like Sukarno, right, rising up in Indonesia during the time of Dutch colonization, right, kicking the Dutch out, and then looking at all of these disparate ethnic populations, similar to what you might see in Syria, right, or any place that's really been impacted by colonization, right, and saying like, we are Indonesian together, even though we come from different places, even though we have different bloodlines, we form a shared Indonesian identity. And so Indonesian superiority based on that wouldn't be about inherent characteristics, it'd be about experience, right, about culture, about learned values, and about things that people share together. And so, yes, I agree, supremacy is kind of a factor, but I did want to make that distinction. The second thing that you said is that people are inevitably supremacist. Like, yeah, for sure. And I think that's just a question about the role of society, right? Like, just because people are inevitably supremacists, and frankly, that's a stupid way to feel. If you need to feel superior to other people just to feel good about yourself, that probably says something about you. But more importantly, right, like it's a question of how do we empower or disempower people who have those feelings of superiority in a society?
Okay, so I'm a convert to Orthodox Judaism. Jews regard themselves as God's chosen people, and the more traditional you go in Jewish life, there's definitely a sense of superiority to everybody else. So you're saying that's stupid, that's primitive, that's backward, that's dangerous. What are you saying about Jewish supremacy?
I wouldn't call it primitive because I think it's such a pervasive force. But yes, I would say that that's silly. Thinking that you're better than someone on the basis of your bloodline is always stupid, no matter who it is.
And
it's
yet
not
that's
stupid
the way.
if you can show that it's true. Like if you have a group of people and they completely dominate another group of people, The dominating group is superior. The ultimate
if you
metric
view
in
your
anything in
ability
life
to
is
like
always
run
survival.
through people, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Yeah, I mean, if you view the superiority or inferiority of a person as based on how many other people they were able to slaughter and steal resources from, then like, sure, I guess they're better, but I would prefer to not measure goodness of a person based on how many others they slaughter.
I'm not talking about.
What about nonviolent? Sorry, Counter. What about someone in boasting about, inventing modern medicine, the gas combustion engine, all of these, Western things of which we used to be proud?
Yeah, I mean, no, right? Like what?
What's
the logic here?
You to characterize it as, I'm sorry, you were on to colonialism, but I think the subject was, sorry, as I was reading it, was that do we have any right to be proud of ourselves as, in our instance, white folk?
Yeah, of course. I think everyone has, I think, and I think as white folk would be like the problem, right? And I think that has more to do with my feelings about race as a system in general, and not like about any discrete category within it. But I would say being proud of yourself over your family lineage, right? Like I'm super proud of the way that my parents were able to come here as first generation Americans and make a life for themselves, right? Of really being able to be people who are successful, right? Like I have pride in that. And I have pride in the way that they pass those values on to me. I have pride in the way that they pass our faith down to me, right? I have a lot of pride in all of that. But it's not on the basis of because I have their genes, right? I'd be proud of that if I were adopted. They'd be proud of me if they were adopted because I'd be their child, right?
I don't know.
No, I mean, to the extent that what you're saying is true, that sort of family lineage is distinct from a racial group, right? Like I'm not proud of other Italian people just because I'm Italian. That doesn't make sense to me.
Well, you mentioned Rome and said they had no concept of race, but in a lot of the translations, they'll describe a family or a tribe as a race, right? The race of, a given character. So, they kind of had that concept. And when they went abroad, they let everybody else keep their identities, you were describing, kind of benign, so to speak, empire of the Romans. But how was that achieved? By allowing people to keep their own gods, which really meant keep your ethnicity, which I don't see us doing now. Do you? With, a universal, liberal rights that I suppose you would espouse.
Yeah, I mean, we would both full-heartedly offer a robust condemnation of multiculturalism for the exact reason that it erases cultures, right? Like the neoliberal way that we force people to assimilate into American society is both unsuccessful and immoral. So we're on the same page.
Well, no, I think it's a problem. Then we're forced to live in separate communities that are increasingly going to fight, right?
I don't think so. I think there's no inevitability to that fighting. And I also think that as long as we understand those categories to be at least partially on the basis of, so if you migrate, for example, to England, you probably don't have all of the things in common with someone from England if you're American, right? But you can work your way into society, right? Like you can live comfortably along people because you share enough of a cultural premise, right? And I think neighboring countries, for example, often share enough of a cultural premise where that kind of movement can happen. And I think movement into a society or a culture that fits you, right? That makes sense, that you adhere to the norms of, I don't see a problem with that, right? And I think most of us don't see a problem with someone who adheres to the norms of a culture, entering that culture and adhering to those norms set up already. And I think that I don't see those things having to be in conflict with each other, right? We can be different. We can acknowledge those differences without saying, and therefore I shall violently take over your society, right? Like we probably don't need to do that.
Well, then do Muslims, are they adhering to the norms of Western societies in which they're inhabiting?
I mean, it's 2 billion people. I think it depends on who you ask, right?
Oh, I mean, the Muslims of Paris, are they adhering to the norms?
Like I said, even if you were American and you moved to England, right, you wouldn't adhere to all of those norms, right? You would still probably have a certain
It would
set
be in
of
England's interest that I'm not too far away from them, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And I mean, so for example, there are some things that are mostly benign, right? So for example, if someone makes an individual choice to like wear a hijab, right? Like I don't see a need to have a problem with that. We have nuns that wear head cup, right? Like that's not really a big deal, right? If there's something like women being forced into marriages, right, which, happens outside of Islam as well, but to kind of carry on with your example, women being forced into marriages or women being forced to wear coverings that they don't want to, then I think that that's the kind of cultural disjunct when it's premised on an injustice and not just an aesthetic difference, then we've got a problem.
Well, I would think, sorry.
Sorry, I just had just going down the Muslim route for a second. Do you think that some societies are more violent than others?
Are some values, maybe you'd have to give an example.
Okay,
I don't know.
Is a violent act objective, right? I'm not being, I'm not very smart, right? But is it kind of a yes or no? If a violent act is committed, is that a violent act? Can we agree upon that at first?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine there would be hashing out about definitions of violence, but absolutely.
There's always going to be hashing out, yeah. Some more than others. But I mean, that was, I wanted to just ask you that because some people would make the claim that the Muslim societies are more violent than the French societies or the English or even the Russians to some extent. So
yeah, I would call those people ignorant, right? And I would say that because that's not true, right? I mean, if you look at something like the French Revolution or the kind of German occupation of France, you can see lots of instances of violence. And so I think to call a people violent, right, or to call an ideology violent, now there are some violent ideologies within that, right? Like ISIS is, again, an example of like very clear using a cultural set of values or at least a set of language that mimics those, right, to carry out violence. That is always objectively bad, in my opinion. I mean, maybe not objective, but like whatever.
Are you kind of equating the Muslim violence to the same violence as war or as a violent, bloody revolution?
So what I'm saying is that not only are there violent, bloody revolutions going on now, right? Like you had the Arab Spring a few years ago, right? Like those revolutions are occurring. What I am saying is that the violence that a population goes through has to be historicized, right? It has to be put in the context of political strife, because I don't think that we would call French revolutionaries who are trying to kick Germany out of their country, I don't think that we would call that just like abstract, ridiculous violence, right? Like that you would at the time, if you were the French government, perhaps call it terrorism, and people died over that belief, right? But like, yes, violence happens, but when you contextualize that violence, I do not believe that any people is inherently more violent than any other.
What I mean, so there's no set of facts, there's no set of statistics that could ever be presented to you to make you ever think that one group of people are just predisposed to violence more than anyone else?
Oh, I don't have that kind of hubris. There's always something that could convince me otherwise.
I don't know,
these are largely quantifiable claims. I mean, one could do a study of violence. I mean, so for instance, the non-state societies, all of them had ridiculously high rates of death per year. Extremely, extremely high. There was the Cato in the 1840s had violent deaths that occurred at a rate of around 1,450 people, if I'm remembering correctly, per year, per 100,000 people. So, like, these are largely quantifiable claims, and it's just not true that there's no one group of people that's more violent than any other.
Well, why don't you present some of that data? Because it immediately brings up a set of questions like, how fucking violent must white people be to colonize half the world, kill a bunch of indigenous people, right? Like, go into Africa, go into Asia, go into the Middle East, right? Like, I mean, at some point, yes, you're right, you could give numbers, but we would find ourselves going back and back and back and finding that actually it's mostly governments who are violent and not people.
Can we like?
Can I ask something quickly? No, we're saying you can in the present quantify. For instance, we can say if you're saying America is violent, you mean it's violent compared to other nations, right? If you're saying America is racist, you're saying it's racist. You're not saying racism exists there. You're saying it's racist as compared to all nations. No.
Oh no, I'm not making a comparative claim. I'm just describing an independent phenomenon.
Just real quick,
that you can, in fact, compare any two populations for violence, levels of violence, no?
Yeah, like I said, I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying that some of the things that would make it really confounding and complicated to do an analysis of who is more violent is that you would have to parse through mergings of countries.
Men are clearly way more violent than women, for instance.
I just think a lot of that is socialization. I don't know what to tell you. Yeah, I mean, yes. Just going to leave it at that.
Okay, so no.
Can I ask?
Because if just one. Oh.
Kayla, go.
Oh, I was just going to say, if it is socialization, if you can make the claim that it is socialization, then what needs to be done to make men not violent? What is being done that makes men violent? What socialization is being done by society that is making men disproportionately more violent than women? Thank you.
So a few examples would be things like the pressure that comes with the idea of the nuclear family for men to be sole breadwinners. When you combine that with declining wages, right? Like there is virtually no family wage left in America. The pressure that men feel oftentimes is the people who are supposed to provide for their families because of that script, that gender role that's placed on them, right? The idea that they should have to, that they don't get their kids very often, right? That they often end up being the ones to pay childcare, right? There are all these sets of pressures that can easily cause people to crack. And then you combine those pressures with a system that is rigged against them, as I think that our economic system is rigged against most people, right? When half of your nation makes less than $35,000 a year in an economy like the American economy, something's going wrong. So I think there are lots of reasons why men are pushed into violence, and some of them are not always ignoble, right? Many of the reasons why people get caught up in these violent impulses are born from just survival necessities gone wrong. And so to give you just a couple examples.
Did you feel these pressures when you were a man?
Well, I never was a man, so I couldn't tell you.
Okay, wait. CV, you wanted to give 2 examples. So CV, I want you to give your examples. I want you to finish your point, and then I get 10 to 15 minutes solo with CV. So CV, go ahead.
Oh, that was my point. I'm sorry. Did I not make 2 of them? Then I might have
okay. You finished with your point then, CV? Yeah, you're finished with your point. Okay, yeah. CV, how would you describe this conversation that we've had to someone that you're a friend with?
Well, I bet I'll talk to my partner about it as soon as I hang up. And I don't know. I mean, I think this was a really successful chat. Like, y'all asked some questions. I hope I gave answers that were somewhat satisfying. I would say that, you know, we obviously covered a big range of things, and I wish that we went in depth into any one of them more specifically, but also we'd probably hit the limits of my knowledge on a lot of this stuff fairly quickly. So maybe I appreciate that we didn't. But yeah, no, this was great.
Yeah, but you'd say more than this was great. Like, how would you describe us? Would you describe us as white supremacists? Would you describe us as trads? I mean, how would you describe us to your partner, you know, in an uninhibited sharing?
So I would probably say that this was a podcast about the alt-right, but I don't think I could pin down any of your beliefs with a label, to be honest. I would never try. That's just not my game. Are you white supremacist? I mean, it'd be easier for me to ask you, and then I could just correctly identify you later.
Yeah, I'm not aware of. My definition of white supremacist is someone who thinks that being white is just inherently superior. And I don't know anyone like that. Even David Duke or Richard Spencer would tell you that there are things where blacks are superior to whites, and there are other areas where East Asians are superior to whites, and where Ashkenazi Jews are superior to whites. So if a person sees that different peoples have different gifts, I just don't know how you can call them a white supremacist.
Yeah, and I think that this is why labels are so fraught, right? And it frustrated you all last night, and I still feel terrible about that, right? But like, I find them not helpful to apply to people. As a rhetorician, I don't look to call people anything. I look to identify where white supremacist ideology, right? So where the idea that white people are inherently superior, where does that crop up in public discourse? What kinds of assumptions or what kinds of things do people say where we can kind of read discreetly embedded in what they're saying those ideas? And I think that, you know, you can draw those lines back from, for example, slavery, right, where they're very obviously there. I think they evolve, they become more complex over time, but I don't think they go away.
And about 20 years ago, I decided I wanted to write a book on the porn industry. So I devoted several months to reading every book that I could find on the subject, and then all the leading articles. And I quickly got a sense of who was reliable and who I could talk to, who was reckless. And so I kind of had a map of the players before I went in and started doing actual interviews. So do you have a sense of who's reckless among the big names on the dissident right? Do you have a sense of who tries to have a fidelity to facts? Do you have that sort of map, or is that irrelevant to you?
I mean, I think to me it's not irrelevant, right? It's certainly less important because I don't study people. at least not in the way that you mean it. But yeah, I mean, no, I wouldn't say I have a sense for within the alt-right who people would consider reckless. I certainly have my own conceptions of recklessness, right? So for example, I think JF is generally someone who people would call not reckless, right? Very put together, very well articulated, well thought most of the time. I find his use of science to often be reckless, but that's not him being reckless. That's the use of science, right? It's the study of the discourse and the text and not the person. I don't know, that's kind of a roundabout answer.
Interesting. So, is there anyone that you've studied, learned about, or listened to on the dissident right that you said nothing surprised you? So, is there anyone who ennobled you? Is there anyone who made you laugh with a perspective that you never thought of? Were there any truths about life that, well, you said you didn't discover anything. So where did you find value in your studies in the dissident right?
And I wouldn't say I didn't discover anything. There was a lot out there I didn't know, right? And I think the fact that nothing surprised me is more maybe my own pessimism and maybe the longevity of my interest in these discourses to just kind of like see them. And I don't know, maybe it's also just like me not wanting to admit in retrospect that some of these things surprise me. But I think, for example, the people who, oh gosh, I only know his real name, and so I don't want to dox him. But some of the people who are often on the Southern AF podcast, I really like those guys. I find them to be funny and amusing.
Keep going. So, because this is going against the tendency. So, for example, New Testament scholars, when they find stories in the Gospels that go against the ideological tendency of the Gospels, they're much more likely to regard these stories as historically true. So, when you, coming from a generally critical attitude towards the dissident right, find things that are amusing or ennobling or interesting, that's interesting. So I'd like you to explicate. Tell me more about people you find funny, people you find profound or ennobling, or that give you some value aside from just being things to just dissect in your academic studies.
Gosh, I would hate to approach anyone in my research as an object of study, right? As something to dissect. That would be terrible. And I tend to not look at people in those terms because I'm always very grateful for the help that they give me, like not only just like with my research, but like the relationships that develop out of that, conversations that come from that are extraordinarily valuable. I mean, this chat, right? Like this wouldn't have happened if not for wandering through various Discord channels where people gave me months and months of their time in conversation. It makes things like this possible, right? It makes it possible for me to come on a show and to hear a perspective of 4 or 5 or 6 different people who disagree with me, who can give me a better rounded view of not what it is that I study, because I think in terms of that one discrete thing, I have a pretty good lock on it, right? But like I said, these things have to be contextualized and part of something much bigger. And the idea that no one has anything to offer, right? That no one has any correct ideas is obviously ludicrous. And so, yeah, like I'm super grateful for the voices I listen to, even if I don't find them surprising.
Right, but you can't give me any examples of any specific individuals or podcasts that you want to compliment aside from you found the Southern Dingo amusing. There's no one else that you want to give a shout out to as in some way complimentary?
Gosh, I mean, I guess I have to give a shout out to Halsey because I just think he's the greatest. He makes me so mad. But I think we entertain each other largely. Not that he's all right, obviously, but just in terms of podcasts that I want to honor in this moment. Yeah, and like I said, you know, I watched a good amount of Worski and JF together. I find JF much more upsetting. I find Worski generally comical. But yeah, like if you just want me to name like 10 things, no, I probably couldn't do that.
I see. Well, I wanted to come in briefly. I'm going to be heading out soon, but you had earlier when we were talking about differences between groups and rates of violence, you wanted to know the source. So there's several, it's a chapter in a book I'm writing, but the primary source for those rates of violence that I gave were from Max Roser's study, Ethnographic and Archaeological Evidence on Violent Deaths. Then there's 2 other studies, a Cato War, and that's from Berkeley, and then the Newer Conquest from Ann Arbor University of Michigan Press. So just the thing I want to slam home before I leave is just that these a lot of these statements that people who seem to come from your type of background make, like there's no differences between people on these issues, it's just not true, because these are empirically verifiable issues. And it doesn't even matter whether or not these issues have been empirically verified, but that they are verifiable. And I think if one wants to know whether or not there is a degree of difference in finding a degree of difference, what that degree is and how big is the gap, then one should just do studies and look at the information that has been compiled, because there's quite a lot of information, even dating back to very ancient Neolithic sites. So that's all I wanted to say. And thank you for having me on, Mr. Ford.
Yeah, I'll make you a deal. You send me any study you think demonstrates that. You tell me the argument you think that study supports, and I will write an article in response.
All right. Thank you for having me on, Mr. Ford. It was nice talking to you again, CV. We never seem to get to talk with Kayla whenever she's on. It's always nice hearing from her, though, and it's always nice hearing from you, Dennis.
Nice seeing you, Cater. We'll talk. We'll talk.
Thanks, Kayla.
Okay, Kayla, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I don't want to open up another can of worms, because you guys, you all have been gracious to me enough to some extent. But I do have to just at least press a little bit on the groups of people, that races of people don't actually commit crimes. Okay, so I guess my question would be, because I don't know, maybe I missed this. You guys were talking about the neurological differences, or I believe someone was claiming that there are no neurological differences. I don't know. I was only halfway here. But if a race of people, and I'm just going to talk within one period of time, one place, we're going to just try to lock this down so we're not jumping from time to revolution to ideological infighting, whatever it is. If one group of people in one place at one time committed more crime at a substantial rate than another group of people living in that same place at the same time, what reasons would you maybe come to? And if this is totally verifiable that they were doing that, if it's not a physiological difference, if it's not a difference in hormones, if it's not a difference in intelligence, in brain structure, in impulse control, what would it be? If I was to say black, say 13% of the population, they made up about 55% of violent crimes, that's quite a lot, especially only for 13%. I mean, that would be my question.
I know it is actually remarkable that if you look at some of these cities, for example, and you compare one city and you look at the black and the white crime rate, that they're different. Isn't that weird how that works out? Surely it has nothing to do with the 250 years of slavery, 100 years of segregation, 50 years of Jim Crow, mass incarceration, right? Like, yeah, you're right. You can compare one city, but if you don't take into account historical context, intergenerational wealth and poverty, right? If you don't take into account the literally, as you say, documented, verified in psychological behavioral studies, in quantifiable studies, in medical studies, right? The impacts of racism on people, which is why we see, for example, I'll just give you a really short example, when people take tests, if you ask them their race ahead of time, people who answer and self-identify as black will actually do worse if you ask them that question ahead of time than if you don't. And the reason why is because there's a set of scripts that get activated within someone's mind, right? A set of mental heuristics. This is something we know about and we can document. Like you said, you want to go quantifiable study for quantifiable study, I could play that game all day. But yes, you're right. If you look at those discrete situations, you divorce them from the political realities that you live in, then yes, you can absolutely make data say anything you want. Right? And that's where there's that saying, there are three kinds of lies, damn lies, and statistics. It's because you can manipulate statistics. And I'll go a step further here. And I'll say that not only do I not think that race exists, but I think that white people largely get conned by the myth. And we've been using it, right, for a long time, America, to be able to make you look at black people and say, well, I'm not doing that, so I must be superior in some way. And in doing so, you don't look at your own... But listen, but in doing so, you don't look at your own surroundings. You don't look at the conditions in which you're living your life. And we did this legally, right? When we broke up slave rebellions, this is when we first instituted white and black as legal categories. And we did it because white and black people were working together to overthrow, or not overthrow is a strong word, right? But they were working together to literally kill plantation owners, right? To kill the people who had them functionally enslaved, if not literally enslaved, right? But after this legal change happened, and you made people into discrete racial categories, you gave black people a substandard position as property, and you didn't give that to white people. And so literally, if you just look at the origin of race in America, you see the way that elites And this is why I always think it's weird that people talk about Jews, because Jews weren't plantation owners in the South. But if you look at the elites who were making these decisions at the time, at the founding of America, you can already see the institutionalization of racial categories that benefit one group over another and that hose white people while they do it, right? The poverty, the crime, the violent crime in white communities is skyrocketing. And it's a result of the poverty that Black people have been dealing with for fucking hundreds of years. And then when it gets applied to you, you act so shocked, like, what could this be? It must be the brown people. And it's like, no, buddy, it's always been the system, right? It's always been the lie. And I don't understand the fixation, the need to scientifically find the ways in which you can be better just so you continue to let people fuck you over. That's a terrible way to live.
So it's the system?
Yes,
it's
of course it's the system.
Right, right. So if I say that it's genetics, that's crazy. But if it's the system, right, that's reasonable. And okay, so going back to the
well, it's crazy because you're wrong about the other one. It's not crazy to say a correct assessment about it.
You and I were never going to reach the same conclusion there at all.
Well, that's true. But when you get your degree in genetics, you can tell me what you think genes are.
Oh, thank you, Miss Rhetorician or whatever you are. So going back to did you say that the black and white dichotomy, the races, they were kind of tacked down at what, 1865? Is that?
Well, no, I would say that the discursive origin is probably closer to the 1500s. I think that particular law was in the 1600s, so prior to Declaration of Independence, Revolutionary War stuff.
Okay. And, I mean, the whole Jews weren't plantation owners. Jews were the ones that owned the slave ships. So I'm just small details, little details.
Sure, but they sure didn't enslave the people once they got here. So the idea it's a great Jewish conspiracy really requires you to just omit white people's participation in the construction of the system entirely, which I think is intellectually disingenuous, but maybe you're right. Maybe they owned a ship.
Oh, well, Your Honor, I was only driving the car that the girl was in the trunk of. I didn't put her in there.
Do you think no white people owned slave ships? Is that what you believe? That it was just the Jews that owned them? Or also that people who own slave ships are not also culpable for this system? Like, I'm not sure what you think this argument gets you.
So the Jews are the system?
Oh, dear Lord. No, buddy. Okay, where did you go wrong? I want to meet you where you are and not be an asshole, which I am admittedly being right now, and I apologize for that.
You're never going to know where I am, ever. Not after what you did to that chemist. No way, never.
No, I didn't mean where you are. I meant like where we missed each other in the conversation. I don't mean where you physically are. I don't need to know where you are physically.
Hey, we're running up. I know you have to leave in about 3 minutes. So, CV, I want to give you the last 3 minutes and go ahead, anything that you'd like to reflect on.
Yeah, I mean, that last thing I said is kind of one of the more important things to me, right? That race is something that doesn't only hurt certain people, it hurts us all, right? And you hear cheesy slogans, like I said last night, an injury to one is an injury to all, right? Like, as people who create societies together, as people living in ecologies where we're dependent not only on each other, but we're dependent on forces beyond our control, like weather and climate and nature and disease. I think that if we want to continue on as a species, we need to stop destroying each other and the planet. I think that if we orient our societies towards meeting people's needs, then people don't have to worry about, I mean, not that you'll ever be free of worry, right? But it's a way to ensure that your concerns are taken seriously, that you are treated with dignity, with respect, with humanity, which is what I want for all people. I just, as someone who lives on kind of both sides of a racial conflict a lot, right? Like, I want that for all of the parts of myself. I don't want to take pride in just one part. And you're right, maybe that unity is a pipe dream, but I think that that's why we have societies. We have societies so that we contain our worst impulses, so we organize ourselves around whatever conception of justice we have. I think that conception of justice should be how to meet people. Like I said, how to meet people's needs without them having to beg. I think you all have needs. I think I want to meet them, right? Like, I want to be a part of the society. Maybe I can't directly, right? But I want to be a part of the society that ensures those things for you. So yeah, I don't know if that makes me objectionable and deportation worthy, then so it does. But I think it's a good way to build a world.
Why don't you give us 2, 3, 4 thinkers that you would like people to look into?
Yeah, so I'll make it easy on people, and I'll give you 3, 2 of which can be found in the same place. So I really love current affairs. If you don't read current affairs, I would. They're funny and entertaining and wonderful. Nathan Robinson is someone who I really like. He's also a fairly staunch free speech absolutionist, so I think he writes a lot of interesting pieces about free speech. And then Yasmin Nair, who writes for them, also has a book coming out about social justice culture as kind of a rhetoric that really doesn't do anything useful and actually can be really harmful in some instances. And so, yeah, those would be the two big people. And then I really like Sarah Ahmed's work. I think she's brilliant. She writes about affect and relationship formation, and I think we could all use a little bit more relationship formation in our lives.
Okay, CV, thank you so much for coming on. It was a real delight to have you on the show.
Great. Yeah, take care, y'all.
Okay, take care. We're going to talk about you behind your back now.
Deal.
Okay, take care now. So, Dennis, you didn't get to speak really in the last 20 minutes. Do you have any thoughts on CV and the things she was saying?
I can't bring myself to dislike CV. I know you all hate me for it.
No, I like CV. I mean, she's got big balls to come on shows like this with absolutely no fear, and she's very cool.
A panel. I think we're formidable too. Yeah, Kayla was awesome. But the last thing I wanted to tell her, I wanted to hope to get one more point in there. I wanted to ask, we can control for historical context. That's ridiculous, right? And they keep invoking slavery in our supposedly particular history. You can control for that. And I mean, there's a reason why, Black folks in Europe, for instance, so resemble our own, But yeah, I mean, I like her, but she just talks in circles too. This business about she wouldn't even cite anyone as a writer that she has respect for. I don't know what that is. She isn't really reading that much of these guys, or I suspect she isn't really delving that deep into the alt-right. She's relying on a few, podcasts and stuff. But
well, I like her. I think most of the points she makes are ridiculous, but I like her because one, she comes on the show, and two, she keeps her cool, and three, she does like the very bare minimum of personal attacks. I mean, she was getting abused last night.
She got a little angry at the end, didn't she?
Yeah. But I mean, it was controlled. It wasn't.
She was disciplined in it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the way she conducts herself, I find admirable. I don't regard most of her points as admirable. I just I think she's an admirable figure for people who, want to go online and publicly argue. They could do worse than looking to CV, just the way she keeps her composure. And even when she loses her temper, it is disciplined. It's not reckless, and it's not like a roaring fire.
Maybe she's a threat because of that. Maybe she is, but we should still know her at least. And I don't, last night.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think she's even remotely a threat. So, I mean, Kayla, I know you have very strong feelings about her doxing some chemistry graduate students. So tell us more about that.
Well, no, I mean, I just, I'm with Dennis here. I believe she talks in circles. You can't get a straight answer out of her. If you were to ask her, is the sky blue? She'd say, well, I would interpret the shade of blue slightly differing from your interpretation of that maybe slightly different shade. It takes 5 minutes for her to answer a yes or no question where she answers maybe two. And that is something that personally I am not a fan of, especially if someone is coming on and saying that they are going to have a discussion in good faith. So I may not be the most graceful of speakers, but I try to be honest.
Okay, so at the beginning of the show, I asked her about that article that she wrote that you were asking her about last night, and she said this was a guy who'd committed a lot of vandalism, and he posted publicly Hitler did nothing wrong. So I don't know the guy's story, and the details aren't of primary significance to me here. To me, if you commit acts of vandalism, and if you publicly state things that 95% of the population finds abhorrent, then you shouldn't be surprised that there's going to be blowback. So if you commit acts of vandalism, like, why should you be surprised or appalled if there's blowback against that? So if this guy committed acts of vandalism, then I don't have any qualms about him being disciplined or removed from the classroom. Kayla, do you have qualms if a guy who commits public acts of vandalism is removed from the classroom as a teacher, but continued to allow to pursue his studies in a research capacity?
Well, I think one, that's a matter for the authorities. I mean, I think everyone here can agree that, you know, we're not a fan of vigilante justice in any form, even if it's journalistic justice. And I also think that the school has every right to look into police reports and file things accordingly. The fact that they had to be urged to do so. And then on top of it, did they even have if the school was really upset and they really had the ability to fully remove him from his position, they probably would have. That's how I see that. I don't know. I think that I don't trust. And you know, I'm new to the internet, but I'm not too new to know I don't trust anything that this person says. I don't trust her interpretation of things because she just, for the short time that I have known her, she does not have a good track record of being upfront and honest about what really goes on. So, I mean, that's my personal opinion, not the opinion of this show or anyone else on it. But I do think that it's a matter for the authorities and it's a matter for the school to act on its own accord. I don't like journalists coming in and trying to be some hero and twisting the arm of these institutions, because we see what's happening already. These institutions, their arms and their legs are being twisted, and they are being twisted towards a certain ideological leaning. And if someone is a free speechist or whatever it is, I mean, I know she tries to cite the vandalism. Well, that's for the authorities. That's for the school to decide, not for some journalist to come in and actually try to manipulate the situation.
Dennis, if Portland, the Oregonian wrote an article about you, quoting accurately things that you said on this show, and was factually accurate. Yeah, you disagree with the slant, but how much of a complaint would you have?
I guess I wouldn't have any, yeah, because we're fighting over something else. We're fighting over who gets to define what's shamed, the moral high ground. That's what we're fighting over. We're not really fighting over the mechanics of it. We're not really fighting over free speech. We're fighting over the ends, you know, yeah. And that's why I was trying to say last night clumsily about we need to reclaim the shaming. She's organizing, CV is organizing these little shaming mobs and going out there and being effective. And we're worried about legality or this or that, you know, but the fact is she's doing it and getting away with it. And what we're trying to do is really seize, frankly, control again, cultural sort of control back from these folks. You know, I wanted to ask her at one point, does she think the alt-right represents power in any form? You know, she is the power now. Her side is, you know, but they still use this revolutionary rhetoric to, you know.
I don't like the big talkers on the alt-right who then, when the words and the things that they do are factually represented, even if it's with a particular ideological slant, are then outraged. Like if I say something publicly on this stream, the way I conduct my life is that if I do something in a public space or say something in a public space, I do it with the knowledge that it could end up on the front page of the New York Times. That's kind of my moral code. How would this look on the front page of the New York Times? And so we had people like Kyle Bristow, who one moment as an attorney was threatening genocide on his critics. And then the next moment, when an article came out that accurately quoted things that he'd said, he then made the most abject and absurd and ridiculous apology and ran away with his tail behind his legs, promising to never again have any participation in politics. To me, that's absurd. Everything that one does in the public space, one should be prepared to see it on the front page of the New York Times. And if you're not prepared to do it, then that's on you.
Well, yeah, but then again, they doxed this poor guy. Gosh darn it, I don't remember his name. The guy from recently committed suicide who might have been hounded.
Andrew Dodson.
Thank you.
Okay, I see that as 95, 99% on him. I don't hold anyone responsible for his suicide but him. I mean, you really think
it's a sick society that marshals this shame, you know, mob, and that isolates that poor bastard and limits his opportunities and makes him think maybe he's getting out. You know, anybody who is driven to suicide is overreacting, obviously, but you know, it's not such a crazy thing for this guy maybe to have thought his life was over. You know,
it is a crazy thing. I see it as 99% on him. What degree of agency do you give him, Dennis?
No, well, no, I see him as an extreme example. It's not just him. Yeah, here's a guy who, you know, suicide is a sort of failure, I guess, you know, but he represents how many more guys were not driven quite that far, where we're just freaking scared off. You know, how many of us are in miserable lives because we're scared off by this stuff, and how many people are impoverished?
Well, I say if anyone's leading a miserable life in the United States of America with all the opportunities that still exist, that is overwhelmingly on them. It's not the fault of society.
Materially speaking,
materially in every way, there's no reason that you can't lead a happy life in the United States of America. If you can't, then it's either, you know, that's on you.
Yeah, but still, we're all entitled to equality before the law and equality of, you know what I mean? That guy Dodson was entitled to the same speech and association rights as the next guy, you know?
Right, but he wasn't prepared to deal with the consequences of his public behavior. Therefore, I don't have a lot of sympathy for him.
So people should, I mean, the thing is, so if someone's curious about a movement, they go to a place like Charlottesville, right? You don't know what you're getting into before it. You don't know what type of institutions are going to be in place ready to strike against you in every sense of the word, unrelenting in their attack. And yet you're supposed to know that if you have curiosity about a political position, or even if you hold a political position, you should expect you will be doxxed, you will be harassed, you will be threatened, and that will be extended to all of your family. And that's fine, right? Because if you can't handle that, if you can't handle the pressure, that's on you. I mean, I just want to know
everything, but that's fine. I agree with everything you just said, but that's fine. I'm just saying you've got to accept reality. Whether or not you like reality, that's a different discussion. But if you choose to participate in a public demonstration, then the repercussions of that, if you're not strong enough to handle the repercussions of that, that's on you. You have really bad judgment.
Do you think that Charlottesville, there was a pivot though? There was a change at Charlottesville. People went to Charlottesville with I don't think any of us knew. You know, so
they were incredibly naive.
Yeah,
there was a huge pivot. But if you show up to an event where you're outnumbered by your enemy 10-1, and your enemy is poised to commit violence on you, and you're relying on law enforcement to protect your First Amendment rights to free, you know, public assembly, you're incredibly prone to self-destruction. Like, you put yourself in a place where you're outnumbered 10-1, and you're relying on the cops to protect you and your rights to assembly, when you're holding a position which is just publicly, clearly there's tremendous pushback against that position.
But that's the whole point of freedom of assembly. That's the whole point of a constitution. I think maybe it's naive to think that your constitutional rights would be upheld in a place like America. But I think, I don't know. I can understand why people may have been naive about that.
Oh, I can understand why they were naive, but they've got to grow up. And it's on the organizers that they put the best and brightest of their group, just turn them into cannon fodder.
Well, you're not going to hear me, kind of think that the things at Charlottesville were done right, because there weren't contingency plans after contingency plans. But I'm just saying that I think to say you should have known this was going to happen when stuff at this level had not even started to happen before Charlottesville. Charlottesville was the catalyst. There's the little linchpin that set all of the institutions finally stepping in sync with each other. You could say they were even goose stepping together. I mean, who knows? But the thing is, that's when it happened. So I think beforehand, we hadn't seen all of these powerful entities really in lockstep until that point. I don't even think we knew they could be in such lockstep with each other.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I'm curious when someone commits suicide because of, let's just say, the social ostracism that results from being exposed as alt-right or neo-Nazi. I think that suicide is 99% on the individual who committed it, not on his critics. What degree of agency, Kayla, do you give to people who commit suicide because they get socially ostracized?
No, I mean, I'm going to say if a bowling ball hits the pins, it's the bowling ball, right? I can totally say that. Now, there is a certain point before that happens when someone else throws the bowling ball, right? They put that in motion and to such a speed where the ability for it to stop before it hits the pins is just no longer an option. I think the thing is, if this guy was, I don't know, part of me thinks that if this guy was really alt-right, if he was really a quote neo-Nazi, I don't think he probably would have done it. I think that's the thing that nobody seems to be really considering. What if this man really wasn't alt-right? What if he really wasn't a neo-Nazi and he was being slandered and harassed? I get it. He killed himself. He did the act. I understand that there's 100% responsibility on him committing the final act. But I think that we have to take it into consideration that there are people in positions that hold powers that are able to slander someone and their family with with just impunity, right? They can just there's no counter to any of their actions. I don't know. I'm just saying I think we need to maybe take a look at that aspect as well. The actual suicide is on Dotson, but there were people that put that suicide in motion. I believe that, and there have been cases to where when teenage girls have killed themselves because other kids have said, kill yourself, there have been charges brought against those people, right? So the thing is, why are we not able to do it with these people? They had, that's my point.
No, yeah, I think it's a good one. Babs, you haven't gotten to speak in a while. What do you want to say?
First of all, that CV discussion was really entertaining to listen to, and I look forward to seeing her on your show again, hopefully sometime in the future, another crazy shit show like that. Very nice to listen to, enjoyable, funny. Second of all, I think that, I guess if I get what you're saying, are you basically saying that it's cause and effect, Mr. Ford?
I'm saying that you shouldn't do things that you're not prepared to see. You shouldn't do things or say things in public that you're not prepared to see on the front page of the New York Times. And if you can't handle the blowback, then you shouldn't do those things. And so that's
and this is true in any context, in any era. Like, let's say, yes, for the people who I see, interesting. But the way you see it is basically okay. And how do you feel about people like let's say someone who during an earlier time when certain things were socially acceptable said something that was perfectly within the realm of acceptable social discourse, then years later has their has people attempt to destroy their life for it? I believe was it Dr. Watson who that happened to?
Yeah. I mean, that's just how life works. It has nothing to do with whether I approve of that or not. I believe that we should first, before we do anything, we should embrace reality. Okay. To me, if you're upset, if you're disturbed, it's because there's parts of reality that you're not accepting. So I say, let's begin with accepting reality. And once you accept reality, you are not disturbed. You can then do your best to promote change in the world. But I think it's far better to try to promote change in the world from a place of serenity and acceptance of reality than rage and disturbance.
I see. Simply just for pragmatic reasons is basically what you're saying.
Yeah, just accept reality. This is reality. 5 years ago, this was acceptable. Now it's not acceptable because you said things publicly 5 years ago that are now unacceptable. Then that's reality that you've got to pay a price for not understanding the curve that history was bending to.
Indeed. But I mean, it depends on your view of history. You know, you might be some might be dialectical materialists, some might be sort of like Spenglerian thinkers, I don't know. But like, assuming that you think that civilization is driven by people and the ideas of other people, and I guess the Overton window is thus driven by those by people, isn't it the actions of other people, or perhaps other people who aren't, I guess, staying in their lane, as it were, that cause the window to shift? So I mean,
yes,
what is to be done about this? What is the remedy in your mind?
Yeah, first of all, accept reality. Come from a place of serenity. don't come from a place of rage. Most people, it seems to me, who join the alt-right are just as most people who join any socialized, marginalized movement are marginalized people. So we're getting a ton of damaged people in addition to a lot of, you know, high quality people, okay? But by and large, people who join marginalized movements are marginalized people. They're disturbed. There are things that are cracked in their psyche. They are predisposed to criminal behavior. They're predisposed to suicide. They're predisposed to all sorts of self-destruction. And so what I think is more important than what's going on in the wider society is what's going on in your own soul. So you need to come from a place of serenity and acceptance of reality. If you come from a place of rage and disturbance, by and large, you'll be far more likely to do harm than to do good for your cause, whatever that cause is. So, for example, CV, I admire CV because even when he was angry, he still operated from a place where, if it was quoted in the New York Times, or if the repercussions of what he was going to say were not going to destroy his life, disturb his family, he was rooted in reality. He did not make a bunch of like nasty, pointless personal attacks. He didn't laugh at people. I've had this on the show. Someone makes a point that another person doesn't like, and the response is laughter. That is classless. That is just not the way to behave in the public space. And so I admire good manners.
Hello, can I talk for a sec?
Yes, please.
I'm sorry, I missed some of that, but I was, I mean, this is interesting. It's good TV. I still think there's a real question about whether or not, like, it's good with a capital G TV. You know, I mean, I think it's a little degenerate, and I guess my hope, Luke, is that you're having CV on is like an attempt to kind of expose the unreality of the sort of CV movement or something. I'm not sure why you're into it, but
okay, yeah, I think the way that CV conducts herself as far as temperament, like, I don't buy almost any of her arguments, but her temperament in engaging in a hostile environment, I think, is a model for virtually everyone.
Well, okay, so I just had one thing I want, because you were just doing the stay in your lane, accept reality stuff, which, yeah, I agree. I mean, that's part of why so many people are so triggered by the transsexual thing, is because we feel like it's a violation of our sense of reality. But I wanted to ask you or Kayla or Dennis or whoever else is here about the question of, like, what you propose we should do to think about how to settle this question of, you know, who gets to determine what the good or what the normal is, and who should be able to decide who stays or who goes or who gets exiled or excommunicated. Because the reality is there is no supervening committee to decide these things. It doesn't.
Right, so it's just power. It's just power politics.
Thank you.
So one group, racial, religious, whatever, one group should seize control. And
thank you.
If you care about your group, you shouldn't, you know, be a pussy.
That's exactly, I just wanted to hear that stated clearly, and I knew you could do it best for me, because that's the conclusion that I'm brought to in this conversation. And all of the attempt to kind of, you know, pose rhetorically or sort of answer CV or whatever, it's going nowhere. I mean, yes, I agree, there's something admirable about CV's way of sort of handling the hostile engagement. But at the end of the day, we are not going to convince CV or anybody who's sort of on that side of the movement. And so at this point, it really is about seizing power. And I just want to just be clear about that. And then we can think about, you know, well, how do you do that, or how do you arrange to do that, or whatever. I don't actually know, but I just wanted to hear someone say that clearly.
You're absolutely right. It is about taking power back, because if we try to argue with them on their same level, I mean, well, okay, Rockwell said that, okay, the Marxist or the communist Zionist Jews are very sneaky, and if we try to be as sneaky with them, and that is how we try to fight them, we will always lose, and we will lose dishonorably. Sometimes you have to choose a different mode of attack, and you actually have to attack in the way that you are strongest. And I don't think doing this type of sophistry back and forth, dancing around the question of what true morality is not always what's best for our group. So, oh, Monique left, but
I hardly see us as in a position of weakness that we pull this person in here. There's like a panel of 4 hostile voices questioning her. No, let's have her in here and let's have her ideas out. I don't see any problem with it. We might be at the worst wasting our time. You want to seize power? Go fucking seize it. And we're going to have, I'm going to tear her fucking arguments apart. I like her. I can't help it. I like her. Fuck it. I like her. And I despise her arguments, and she represents evil. And I hope to make her cry at some point. Then I'll be happy when I made her cry because I've totally destroyed her worldview. But, you know, all this bullshit. Sorry, guys.
I'm sorry, Dennis, all this bullshit. What do you mean?
Just, oh, should she be on? Should she not be on? No, I don't. Are we at a disadvantage by having her in here? She's that much better than us. Where does she have the advantage? Well, they have the advantage in the mainstream. Out here, those ideas don't have the advantage. Out here, those ideas go to die. And like I said, we might be wasting our time because it might just be a dead end. But I don't, like earlier, I said she's a threat, Luke, and you said, no way, she's a threat. I don't really think of like she's a threat. I think anybody on that side who presents a good image like she does is a threat. You know, that's the enemy. And if the enemy's good, that's worse than if they're bad. You know, we brought her in here last night and you know, Kevin, I think, thought that he had this snowflake that he was just going to push over, right? And like I said, she never says anything. I don't think she's right about anything, and I'm not impressed with her arguments or any of it. It's all nonsense. But again, I don't know. I'm talking in circles myself. But, you know, and I get frustrated with this idea of seizing power. They'll tell me how, you know. Tell me how that works.
Well, Donald Trump seized power. He mounted a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, overcame the Democratic Party, overcame the news media, overcame basically every major institution in this country. And he made a bunch of compromises, but he seized power. Now, he doesn't have unlimited power. He's certainly being constrained by reality. But to me, Donald Trump, 2016, 2015, 2016, that's an example of seizing power. One man basically overcame every major institution in the country, in the world.
Right, but like we've seen him confounded too. At the same time, we've seen at the same time the remarkable durability of the deep state and how it's just reacted by just kind of almost absorbed him. And they might still be able to run him out of office if they get Congress back. So yeah, I mean that's true, but we're also getting a demonstration of how we might already be so far gone that we can't get power back through the ballot box, at least through, you know, just like our guest was talking about. I like her definition of extremism. It's when you can't achieve your goals peacefully. You know, that's not a moral definition for me. And, you know, I mean, it might sound like moral relativism, but it's the relevant way to look at it for us. Because we're like, we keep having this argument. We're arguing about who gets power. We're arguing about who gets to set all the rules, basically, you know, and her side's winning. And you know, anyway.
Kayla, did you?
I think Kayla wants to say something.
Kayla, go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm thinking about how to word this. I don't have a problem. I don't know. Maybe I stroked out for a second and I didn't hear this part. But like I don't have a problem with CV coming on YouTube, coming on the internet. Because like that's like that's a perfect propaganda poster for a traditional lifestyle. I mean, I'm sorry, that's how I see that. Because I'll stop there. But like the thing is, I don't have a problem with someone like CV coming on the internet, coming and spouting her ideas or whatever. But I do have a problem with people like CV being in academia. And so, yeah, I mean, but I get it. It may sound LARPy to say that we have to take back power. But I get it. How do we do it, right? But do you disagree?
It's wrong that she's in power. Yeah, she's going to come on here again and going to hammer on that subject. I don't know what else we can do.
Well, I tell you what, I would think it'd be interesting to get polling from normies who watch the discussion. Every one of us do not find her arguments convincing.
Right.
I think with normies that she would have at least half of them. So I think it'd be worth understanding why
because people are stupid.
Yeah, I don't like that way of thinking.
You don't think there's an appeal to authority that most people abide by? That if you sound like an authoritative figure, most people, they won't really listen to your arguments, but they will follow you?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, but I think it's worth understanding rather than framing it in terms of people are stupid. I want to understand reality.
People are followers. They're not stupid. People are followers.
So then why can't we comport ourselves and frame the things we say in ways that tap into that natural human desire to follow, so that we're more effective than the CVs of the world?
Sure. I mean,
so that means we have to get PhDs, some of us. It means that we have to make more than 6 figures, some of us. It means we need to write brilliant books. It means we need to do scintillating streams. It means that we need to be in good physical shape. It means that we need to have our relationships solid. It means that we need to exude happiness and serenity and clarity. We have to be the best we can be if we're going to defeat the enemy.
Yeah, I'm all for people building themselves up to the strongest individual, because a strong individual will lead, to a strong collective. But I'm just not trying to put it out there as some hyper individualist type of thing where only care about yourself, only better. I don't know. I mean, that's kind of where I am, but maybe that's
there's nothing that I'm saying that's remotely individualist. I mean, I'm a convert to Orthodox Judaism. I live my life within Orthodox Judaism. I think that a life lived as an individualist is such an inferior life to life lived with community. I talked about we have to have solid relationships. That means we should be getting along with people at work. We should be getting along with people in line at the supermarket. We should be getting along with people at the game or at the bar. If we're not getting along with people, if we're not forming varying degrees of bonds with other people, we're not going to be successful in life. We're not going to convince many people of our ideas, and our life's going to be miserable.
Can I just say one thing, Luke? But you are giving into an individualist perspective when you say it's all about what you should expect personally to happen to you as a result of speaking out, say, on the internet, because that's an outrage. That's a grand crime that's being perpetuated on us. And to be rid of it somehow, to fight it, one of the things we have to do is speak out against it and weather its frickin', weather this storm. I mean, how much are we going to step back, and this guy who, an individual who gets doxxed, if somebody is driven to suicide, like I said, it's just indicative of the severity of what they're submitting us to. I mean, they're two separate issues. I think we just need to be stronger. It's not fair. It's not fair that we need to be more admirable in our lives and to be, on eggshells, but we do. But again, they're two separate things, Luke. And I think,
okay, let me push back, Dennis. So you said we need to be outraged. So you, Dennis Dale, are you more effective? Are you a better person? Are you a better vehicle for promoting the values that you believe in if you were to have more outrage in your life, just the amount that you've got right now, or less? By and large, has outrage, resentment, and anger overall, has that been a net positive for your life, in an indifferent effect, or overall a net negative?
Well, they're three different things. Overall, a net negative. Yeah. I mean, again, it's a personal thing. But outrage, again, there's conceptual, there's objective outrage. Resentment, again, is something that it might come of justified outrage. It might come of unjustified, imagined outrage. but it's not a good thing that's going to mess you up. So yeah, again, it's not good for me, but again, I'm in this world which is submitting me to outrages, so I don't want to ignore that to achieve some serenity that, you know, I don't think is going to help in the end. I mean, outrage is like a fuel additive. You put a little in there and it juices you up, but you don't want to put too much.
Okay, so if I were to answer my own question, overwhelmingly anger, outrage, and resentment have been negative effects on my life. They have inhibited my ability to do good. They've inhibited my ability to live well. They've inhibited my ability to connect and to influence other people towards the things that I want to influence people. So from my perspective, the more serenity you have equals the more clarity you have, equals the more effective you are at doing anything you want. Babs, anger and resentment overall, has that been a net positive in your life, a net negative?
Strong neutral, because I think that of all people, as Malcolm Gladwell says, a lot of the greatest people are driven by a sense of insecurity, instability, something to prove, perhaps even a bit of resentment and bitterness there. I think that in my personal life, some of the smartest, but also some of the least intelligent things by a long shot, and some of the things with the worst repercussions resounding throughout the rest of my life have been done by me in moments of anger, in moments of rage, in moments of bitterness, or in moments of sort of a cool, burning sort of distaste. So I would really say that ultimately it cancels out, pretty much on the dot cancels out.
Okay, Babs, is there anything else you want to talk about?
I think that I suppose not really. You were there. You're sort of preaching stay in your laneism earlier. I'm just again curious. How do you think things have gotten to where they are right now, in the sense of Overton window shift? By what means, if you could reduce it to a few simple
very
factors?
easy. Northern Europeans lost the will to rule, and they started losing it at the time of the American Revolution. At the time of the American Revolution, what's now the 13 colonies was 85% Anglo. As soon as they stopped worrying about that and allowed non-Anglos to pour in and to steadily reduce Anglo power and influence, they'd lost the will to rule. So everything that has spiraled since the American Revolution, I see is pretty much inevitable. And I think that now you can just say it more generally, white people in the United States of America and around the West simply lost the will to rule. That's the problem.
I see.
There's just a lack of will. Just like the English lost the will to rule India, they could have kept ruling India for hundreds of years, not that they should or shouldn't, but the reason that they got kicked out of India is that they simply lost the will to rule. And if a people loses the will to have autonomy and to conduct their own affairs, which is by and large what white people have done around the West, then they're inevitably going to lose. And until they regain the will to power, they're just on a suicidal path.
Right. I think we lost Babs. But
well, what do you think of that, Dennis?
Power abhors a vacuum. So, yeah, okay, that's not the whole story. Did the WASP just decide to pack up and leave, or were they convinced? Whatever the case, somebody who's going to fill the void behind, or did they just redefine themselves? Now it's globalists. They think it's no longer ethnically defined, but there's still nonetheless a will to rule on behalf of some group of people. That get to hide because they're no longer defined by ethnicity,
Well, Anglos were fine with turning the Anglican Church over to the communists.
Were they? Yeah. I don't know the history. I wish I knew how it happened. I look at it with this perplexity. I don't know. You're a WASP. And there was no longer much of a will to rule as I grew up as a WASP. Really?
It was dying out. It was all about outreach to Africa and to being respectful to other religions and not seeing any racial differences, and all are saved in Christ. And so when the Anglo lost the will to rule, he just became put on a path to destruction. The Anglo is not cut out for between group competition. Jews are cut out for between group competition.
Well,
Japanese are, Chinese are, Anglos in their own societies tend to have universal morality, and they're simply going to be outcompeted by tribal groups that practice dual morality. So if Anglos open up their societies to large numbers of people practicing dual morality, Anglos are simply going to lose power.
They do fine if they keep their borders up and we don't let the other people in, and then tell ourselves that we're not really letting foreigners in. In fact, they're more us than we are. Immigrant America, a nation of immigrants nonsense. Yeah, no, we could. Yeah, we all of our great liberal values that are indeed virtues, are now being used against us simply because we don't define borders. I mean, conceptual borders, right? We can't even define what white means, for instance. So yeah, we're letting other people in, and like I said, the WASP may have decided to acquiesce in power. Somebody else is going to fill it. Regardless, I think in parts of Europe it'll be Islam, for instance.
I mean, did the decline begin with the American Revolution? Was that like a key way station in the decline of the
French Revolution, or I don't know. I don't have the chops. I don't think there's ever useful to look at some big turning point. Rarely, but maybe it was just inevitable that once we adopted our Christianity plus our particular form of secularism, coming from our biological cultural inheritance as these individual Northern Europeans, all of that combined, get to this place where we just willfully turn ourselves. I don't know.
Okay, so I'm going to get to you in a second, Babs, but I want to respond to my favorite Holly in the chat room. She says, give me a break, that this theory that Anglos can't do intergroup competition. So Holly, explain to me how a group that practices universal morality is going to outcompete groups that practice dual morality. I just don't see how that can logically work. Babs, you wanted to weigh in on something.
The way I see it is sort of, I guess the great crisis, if there is one, is how would I put it? Well, some people say, oh, the Enlightenment, or they point to other points in history. Some people even look back further than that. But I think that, I guess, the reason why people like Savitri Devi, and there are others that say that Jews are sort of like this unique people cosmically in this negative sense, is because in a lot of ways we are the example of cosmopolitanism, deracination, sort of secularism, loss of one's home, loss of one's land, because of this sort of, like, I guess, divine consequence of the galut. So through the galut, we sort of are the, I guess, kind of the example of this. But these are fundamentally the kind of problems that afflict everyone. And, the same things, secularism, rootlessness, a society that doesn't have a balanced, I guess, fully fleshed out, quote, like, spiritual castes. It's like, because we live in, like, this, I mean, whatever you want to call it, this Kali Yuga of sorts today, we live in this, this has been going on to the Jews, to the Hebrew people, I guess, for a while. So it's sort of like there is some truth to when people say, like, Savitri Devi, people say, like, Jews are like this sort of cosmic example people. These things that have afflicted Jews for a very long time now afflict us all. It's sort of this age of cosmic deracination and loss of identity, secularism, loss of self, loss of one's way, loss of a coherent metaphysic. I think that and then there's just this crisis of modernity. I mean, capitalism is a part of it, sure, but there are other things involved as well.
We live in a Kafkaesque universe now, you say. Hi, Babs.
Hello.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I was
no problem.
You're saying that I just caught the last part.
It's no problem. I think my Google Hangouts isn't working. It seems to be continually closing out on me every time I try to enter the call.
I keep getting bumped too somehow.
Yeah. Well, it seems to be working now, so everything's all right. Anyway, let's see. What was
I'm sorry to interrupt so much tonight.
Go ahead.
I just interrupted to say that.
No. You were talking about some interesting stuff with Luke before. Please go on about what you were talking about.
I wasn't talking.
I didn't mean to interrupt. I mean, no, you were discussing with Luke. You were talking about sort of like, you know, I guess like the problems of our age, and you were talking about staying in your lane and stuff like that.
He's asked a question about why do WASPs surrender?
Yeah, that's what it was. Why do WASPs surrender? I don't think it's, the point is that I'm making is I don't think it's just WASPs surrendering. Like from all the way from East Asia to really across the entire world, everyone is surrendering to the same disgusting kind of thing to the same degree. But it's almost like it's kind of a zeitgeist. It's like a cloud of toxicity that moves on its own almost.
Well, and it has a disparate impact, though, if what we say is true.
Oh, most certainly. I agree. I absolutely agree.
I view it as a solvent that eats right through my liberal sort of soft society quickly, and something more durable. Maybe Chinese identity, certainly Judaism doesn't, but is affected, but not as badly. You know, manic.
Exactly, I agree. And in this regard, I think that it's a question of the unique susceptibility to this sort of malaise of modernity, or whatever you want to call it, that is present within certain European populations that we're talking about here. Welcome, Monique.
Yo.
Hi.
Hi there.
How we doing?
Love the art, man.
I feel like, yeah, I mean, the energy in here has been weird for the last day or so, and it's like, really? It's a lot. Honestly, it's a lot to keep up with, and there is this, like, I think, like, actually, for the first time, I'm understanding what Luke's saying about stay in your lane a little bit. And I think I was able to hear it because he wasn't persuaded by what he was hearing from CV. And so we know that he's not on the same side as that. And so he is interested in winning this, at least in the long run or something. And so I think stay in your lane. I mean, I'm just glancing at the rules for radicals that I peeked at a while ago. I mean, there are all, like, you should read the beginning of this PDFs online. Luke, have you read rules for radicals?
No.
I'm glancing at it, and I mean, look, can I just read you? Like, here's half a paragraph. He says, any revolutionary change must be preceded by a passive, affirmative, non-challenging attitude toward change among the mass of our people. They must feel so frustrated, so defeated, so lost, so futureless in the prevailing system they are willing to let go of the past and chance the future. This acceptance is the reformation essential to any revolution. To bring on this reformation requires that the organizer work inside the system among not only the middle class, but the 40% of American families whose incomes are low. They cannot be dismissed by labeling them blue collar or hard hat. They will not continue to be relatively passive and slightly challenging, okay, etc. The point is, like, this is us now, right? And like, it's the blue collar now is on our side largely. I mean, you can argue about the black people, but like, most white people now are probably, and I guess blue collar there aren't blue collar jobs left anymore, but the economically disenfranchised, that's us now. But I said just before you step back in, Luke, that tonight was kind of the first time I heard sort of semi-favorably what you were saying about staying in your lane in a way that didn't trigger me. So maybe you're just playing the strategic game, which is to say, like, we need to win this essentially non-violently, right? Because that's the only other option when we talk about reclaiming power, is to, like, storm the Bastille, and I don't see any of us able or willing to do that. It's not realistic.
Well, look, you got to look at the context. Sorry.
Go ahead.
You got to look at the context. This is taking place on a Jewish streaming channel. So whatever I really think, I have to conform what I express on this streaming channel to the context that this is a Jewish streaming channel. and there are certain norms. So even if I had far firmer, far more robust ideas, if they cannot be fruitfully, safely expressed, I'm not here to commit suicide in the service of more robust ideas. So I'm gonna say what I'm gonna say in the context. Like I speak differently in a synagogue than I speak in a bar. I speak differently on a Jewish streaming channel than I do one-on-one with people.
Part of the reason that what you're saying is so interesting is that you're saying this is a Jewish forum.
Yeah.
But to some extent, so is the country. Like that's what we're really kind of
right. So take that into account and make sure that you comport and speak in a way that that accommodates the powers that be until you change the powers that be.
Let me just finish this paragraph. He says, to build a powerful organization takes time. It is tedious, but that's the way the game is played. If you want to play and not just yell, kill the umpire. What is the alternative to working inside the system? A mess of rhetorical garbage about burn the system down? Yippee yells of do it or do your thing. What else? Bombs, sniping, silence when police are killed and scream. I mean, we would have our equivalents of his complaints here, right? Public suicide, etc. He says all this is an absurd rallying cry when the other side has all the guns, and that's what they have now. Lenin was a pragmatist. Okay, that like this is. I think this is interesting, and I think we should read it. It translates so easily into our situation that I'm able to start thinking like you're saying. Okay, realistically and strategically, this is a 40-year war. It's effectively a war, but it's going to be a non-violent, it's going to be a subversive, it's going to be an underground revolution. We need to be raising children, like thinking in these terms, right? They're going to be inside the institutions, but not of the institutions. This is the way that they won in the 60s, and it's the way that we'll win if we're going to win in the next 50 years.
Yeah, I mean, there should be different messages for different. Just what Hillary Clinton talked about. Like she had one message when she spoke to Wall Street, and she had a different message on the campaign trail. And I see that as a model. Like you should teach your children to be able to succeed in this world. Don't teach your children to alienate all the other kids and all the other teachers and to be unemployable. Teach them how to get along and teach them how to detect who they can trust. Just like here, I'll give you an example. So Jews are pretty good at between group competition. And so here's a Jewish company dealing with a Chinese-run small business. And by and large, Chinese have a far worse reputation for dishonesty than Jews. Like everyone I know who deals with Chinese to a large extent finds that they will cheat you every possible way. And so this Jewish company dealing with a Chinese operated small business deliberately, it seems, sent excess goods on an order to see if the business was honest, they'd report that back, then they would know that they could trust the business. Well, the business was honest, they reported that they received more than they paid for. And so the Jewish company then says, okay, this is a business we can trust. So you should teach your children how that they can tell who they can let their hair down with, and who you can trust.
One more idea is that because Holly said so in the chat, and I think she's right. I've been thinking that the churches are going to be an important part of this. And listen, you guys, this is a new age. It does not matter whether you believe it in any metaphysical sense. These are institutions with buildings and resources that already exist and that can't kick us out. Okay, so you get your ass in the pew, but more importantly, get there when there are the book clubs and stuff, and calmly and peacefully and serenely say what you think, okay? And all you have to do is be willing to do that, because these people, are not going to kick you out, right? It's unchristian to kick people out. So just get in there and say what you think. And I'm going to make a real effort to do that this year. It's going to be hard because I hate the whole aesthetic of churches right now, but that's the point. Like, we're trying to retake them from, Satan, basically.
Exactly. Those are great points.
we don't have time for the long march through the institutions, do we? We have to seize some beachheads somehow.
Well, I mean, okay, in the like, not in the sense that this is why Alinsky said you can't go backwards, is because it's not going to be 1957 again. But I think like we will have a plurality, let's say, so meaning not a majority, but a plurality, for the foreseeable future, probably till 2100 or something, so that's enough time, I think.
And also, you can see the beachhead on YouTube. I mean, the most interesting intellectual conversations are on the dissident right on YouTube. When the internet came about, it was immediately colonized by Orthodox Jews. The overwhelming amount of quality content regarding Judaism on the internet is by Orthodox Jews, even though they are only about 12% of all American Jews. So Orthodox Jews seized the internet. You want to talk about Judaism on the internet? The conversation's dominated by Orthodox Jews. You want exciting, cutting-edge, intellectually stimulating conversation on YouTube? It's overwhelmingly on the side of the dissident right. That's a beachhead.
Interesting.
Right, but where to? I got angry earlier. I'm so sorry that I started shouting earlier. It's not because I disagree, but somebody said we have to seize power, and it's so frustrating when I think we've been winning the argument for a while now, and you don't see it kicking in. Right. And Luke pointed out earlier, it's how remarkable Trump is in so many ways, but then at the same time, it still somehow proves the durability of the deep state. It's very blackpilling for me. It thinks that if he's our last best chance, God help us,
Oh, look at Nathan Coffness. You guys are sick of hearing me talk about Nathan Coffness. This is a guy who has gotten a bunch of prestigious professors to sign on to a widely read essay whose bedrock is racial realism. This is a guy marching through the institutions, getting his PhD from Oxford, who's a race realist, who recognizes that different peoples have different gifts. And along the way, he has got the most prestigious professors in his area to sign on publicly to a race realist document. I mean, that's marching through the institutions and making a difference.
I can go. This is one. I heard Frame Game say about a week ago or something that, like, he did kind of admit that at the end of history we will have to part ways. Like he knows that there is sort of different group interests down the line, but for now he's willing to like work in the coalition. I feel sort of the same way about Coffness. Like, Coffness is Jewish and he's a beta little weak man. He might even be in a wheelchair or something. The point is that like I've been reading Nietzsche again. I know it's a meme, but like, you guys, read Genealogy of Morals. It's where we are still. It's happening. And the point is that when Coffness marches through the institutions, he's actually doing so really on the same terms that CV is. I mean, he's the weak in a sense, and he's playing that sort of a game. Ultimately, that's harder for us. Like, because it's hard, because they won't see me. I'll never be able to play the weak. It doesn't matter what story I tell. And so I'm not sure quite how to do that, right? I don't get to show up. I think Kayla was talking about authority. It's the whole question. Is like, how do you establish authority? And you can do it in the old sense of trying to, get the white collar, have your children get PhDs and infiltrate that way. But ultimately, I'm not sure. I don't know. It seems to me like maybe charisma.
If you host the dinner party, you have more authority than if you're a guest. If you host the party, you have more authority. If you host the book club, you have more authority. If you fund a group, if you are the primary funder of your church or your synagogue, you have considerable authority.
I mean, that's hard. Yeah, I know. I'll try to.
I host this stream. I have a lot of authority. I can mute all of you, okay? Because I developed and built this stream, and you're each building and developing your own kingdoms.
I mean, it's just like, I could maybe try to start tithing or something, but
you're an intellectual. You're never going to make money. You're not going to build your power through money. But right. You can host dinner parties. You can host book clubs. You can publish an online magazine, or you can host streams, and you can do it in a way that you don't have to delete them every few months, but you can figure out a way to do it so that they build, rather than you do this great work, you attract a substantial following, and then it all gets deleted. Now, there are many advantages to that strategy, but you can also adjust that strategy so that you're actually building something, you're building a kingdom, and you're building authority, rather than throwing it away.
Well, I mean, this is a very hard topic, right? And one of the things I was going to say to you, I know that the energy is high tonight, but kind of unrelated. People should know that Luke and I, who've been talking now for 1.5 years on streams, have never spoken offline, as far as I know. Like we just hit record, okay? So this is it. You've seen it all. Yeah. And I think that the reason that that's like sort of important here is that, you know, like I've been kind of critical sometimes of Brundle after the streams. I go like, you're cucking, man, you know? But then Brundle comes back and he tries to explain to me like what you just said, that he's trying to be strategic about what he can say, how he can keep his, you know, his forum or whatever. I don't have this sorted out yet. This is a frustrating and kind of an upsetting thing, right? Because in a sense, I did feel like I could say what I thought through the first 35 years of my life. And so I'm an old dog. It's hard to learn this new trick of like, oh, you know, so I'm going to have to like, because it seems like now, not only can I not, I mean, you know, I could try to speak in parables or something. Like that's one strategy for doing this, right? Like talk around the subject. But there's also, even if you're speaking in parables, there are these hard lines that you're saying observe them. And I'm saying, you know, sometimes go under a pen name and don't observe them. I mean, as many of your guests do. And so maybe we need a mix of that. Probably that's the wise strategy. But yeah, I hear you.
We can all build a kingdom.
Can I just push back on the? I think it's great advice. Luke's trying to tell people you can feel just how far you can go. This is a worthy cause, so you don't want to go kamikaze. You want to get in the idea of just how far you can take it. But there's something wrong with that too, and that is an implicit acceptance of our limitations too. You know, I don't like that. I agree with it. I think people need to observe it, but it's what you just said, Mannequin. That we both.
Dennis, one of the reasons that's so important is it's like part of the real struggle here, and part of the reason the emotion keeps bubbling up for so many of us is because part of what's being negotiated is like, are we what's the word? Nietzsche talks about being noble born or being men of resentment. Okay, so you argue differently depending on which category you're in, you know? And part of what Luke's kind of asking us to do is to start to think and just accept the reality that we are now men of resentment. We're not the aristocrats, you know, we're the plebs now. And it's so hard to give that up. Like it's because that's your whole identity is tied up in that. And I don't know whether to make the transition or not. I think that's something we should be talking about though. Where to argue from, you know? I mean,
right, you got to understand that you're operating in enemy territory and that you're operating in under occupied government, and that's the reality. And if you deny that, you're denying reality. And if you deny reality, that's a really lousy basis for trying to make a positive difference in the world.
I'm starting
to be happy.
I'm starting to think that you're right, as truly painful as it is to admit, just like Dennis said, like, you know, we don't want to feel this. Like this is really uncomfortable, especially like, I mean, you know, I got young kids, and to realize that they're going to grow up in a slave world, basically, you know. But maybe, as you're saying, at least if you're interested in the arena of ideas and trying to make progress, you do have to start from the starting line. And maybe that's where we are. I don't know.
Well, look what intellectuals did in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe when it was controlled by communism. They found ways to live and to survive and to keep the cause of freedom going. They didn't run into the machine guns. So they dealt with a little harder form of totalitarianism than we deal with, but it's a good model. And there will never be a time when you can speak freely without consequence. Never, ever, ever. Every single possible society will punish you for saying some things that you want to say.
Yeah, but don't you think there are some people in some societies who feel, even if it's not true, they feel that they can say what they believe? Are you saying it's like one of these late life maturity things where you just realize that no one really ever lets it out?
Anyone who thinks that they can say everything that they want to say is in all likelihood delusional. That they think they can say it without consequence. Even if you're 80 years old and you're a Nobel Prize winner, if you say that you're gloomy about Africa's prospects, you'll get the consequences that James Watson got. And he is a Nobel Prize winner, and he was 80 years old, and he was rich, but he was unpersoned. So you don't say the things that are going to get you unpersoned if you don't want to deal with those consequences.
One thing occurs to me, because that's a good example, the James Watson example, precisely because he clearly is sort of the noble born. He's the elite, okay? I wonder if now is precisely the time when like the beer hall or the blue collar might be able to actually say the things they believe and not get noticed by the New York Times. Like that's one of the things that, early on at least, I kind of relied on your channel is because, I mean, I'm a third tier professor of whatever, and no one I know watches this. It's too autistic. And, I'm kind of relying on the self-selection of the audience. I'm getting nervous about it. But at the same time, like, I think that if some 22-year-old is watching this and, he's in a bowling league and he dropped out of college and stuff, like maybe he's our guy. Maybe he's the guy who can say what he thinks and not face the consequences. Because what can the New York Times do to you once you've got nothing? Those guys have to be out there increasingly.
Yeah, I mean, if Europe is going to be saved, it'll be saved by its soccer clubs. So right. I think, we can all go join a soccer club or a bowling league and create it as a proto-revolutionary organization, but do it, low key and do it with the support of your peers, not against.
But I mean, like what this argues for, though, really is the necessity of solidarity with, the plebs. This whole thing where like Richard Spencer's gonna it's gonna be like an elite atheist movement. I'm increasingly doubtful of that. This needs to,
like in vast swaths of Israel, it's socially acceptable and encouraged to chant death to the Arabs. Like that's a form of national expression which is totally socially acceptable in parts of Israel. So too, there are parts of America or England or Canada or Europe where you can say similarly ultra out there things that would not be acceptable to the ruling media elite, but you can find social support and bonding where in that circle it's completely acceptable to say your nationalist sentiments.
Yeah. Oh, this is interesting. It's also isn't it funny that like I mean the transsexual thing has been a real trigger, hasn't it? It seems like it flipped a switch. The energy got really wonky in here last night and again today. It reminds me of sometimes we've said in the past that I think for a lot of us the Obergefell decision was really very alienating, and I think the whole sort of gender is fluid and doesn't mean anything thing is similarly alienating and sort of pushes you into that place where you realize what we were just saying a moment ago, which is that you're in occupied territory now, like it or not.
Also, I don't think it's so much that she was a tranny. I think that it was that she was so effective, not in the sense that any of us were persuaded, but if you had the slightest self-awareness, you realize that a normie watching would very likely think that she was one person taking on 6 hostiles and beating us. So, I mean, we don't like what she had to say, and we think her arguments are ridiculous. But if you have any self-awareness, you realize that if a normie was to watch this, that the way she comported herself and the way she made her arguments would win a lot of people who don't, lean one way or the other. And that's frustrating for us who, think we're in the possession of truth and that she's on the side of evil. I mean, she was confident, she was poised, she was articulate, she sounds good, like Barack Obama. You listen to Barack Obama, it sounds good, it feels good, it's hypnotic, it puts you into a certain space. And she also had some of those same qualities. Dennis, you haven't had a chance to say much.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's attitude, and she was up against one of our guys, whose attitude was just a jarring sort of juxtaposition, and you can't do that. We can't afford this model though, Luke, this samizdat model like for the Soviet Union, because the capitalist world isn't out there waiting to save us, so to speak. I mean, the clock is ticking, and the ground, they're pulling it out from under us. So I think.
Yeah, but is there anything that we can learn from it? Yeah, I think there are some things we can learn from the communist experience of living as dissidents under communism.
Right, but I don't. Sorry.
Yeah, I didn't mean to. I missed 30 seconds there, but I was just on the question of how persuasive CV was. I don't think that really matters anymore. I mean, I used to, and by the way, I'm like a diehard, like autistic, reason-based, like I used to love just arguing to the end of the line. But one time I had a friend who told me that, it's very seldom, in fact, probably never, that a person like listens to a debate and is persuaded on the spot. And that's way more true now than it was when my friend told me that. I mean, people have settled it in their imaginations, and these people certainly, they're not open to persuasion, and I don't think we are really anymore either. And so at that point, like as I said half an hour ago, it does become about like power. And so I don't think, I mean, personally, I don't see what value there is in talking to CV, because she's not going to help us decide how to gain power back, because us gaining power back is against her interest,
I'll tell you one reason to have people like CV on it. It's so obvious. I don't know why you don't see it. It's that it preserves a YouTube channel. It preserves a forum. It preserves cover for wide-ranging discussion of ideas. If you just have a bunch of alt-righters type, you're just asking for your channel to be showered and for you to be socially ostracized and destroyed. So bringing people like CV on protects the channel, protects me individually, protects all of you individually, and it's just so obvious. I don't know why people don't see that.
It's like one of the things that I would want to talk to you about off camera is like, I can't ever tell with you if you do believe certain things and then don't say them and kind of rely on people to like have the ESP with you. That seems to be
obviously, because it's in my self-interest to preserve that ambiguity. I am not interested in committing suicide. I know a lot of people on the alt-right are dying to commit suicide. They're dying to run into the machine guns. I'm not. I consciously preserve ambiguity.
Okay. That's, I mean, yeah. That's.
I don't know why anyone wouldn't if they have things to lose. Like, you're suicidal if you're not preserving ambiguity.
Well, but we weren't for so long. That's what I'm saying is we didn't really like. I don't think William F. Buckley was very ambiguous. Like, he lived in a world where he could challenge Noam Chomsky and still be respectable.
He used to be on the side of white people, and as that became socially unacceptable, he changed with the times.
Well, then what's
the National Review was a outlet for white people in the 1950s and 60s, even into the 70s, and then it got the cues and it changed.
So, but is your argument that people like came along with him implicitly, and that helped a pro-white movement, even though he cucked and stayed in his lane? Like, you see what I'm saying? What's the point if you have to make such a compromise? Now you're just now you're just on TV. Who cares? That's what I really don't care about on YouTube and stuff. Like, I don't want followers. I don't want. I have a job. Like, I don't want to do this. I mean, you know what I mean? So, like, the thing about I get why Buckley with his big platform would maybe kind of consider where the hard lines are, but if you're willing to observe them all, where does that get you?
Well, it gets you, like people may not like Steven Pinker, but he says a lot of politically incorrect things. He gets a lot of, red pills out there. There are other people who get, Dennis Prager. He observes the social proprieties, but I remember when I first started listening to him, he said blunt things about race that nobody else on the radio ever said. He figured out how to walk the line, but he was more blunt about race than anyone else I heard on the radio. So you can make a considerable difference while playing within the system. You don't have to rush for the machine guns. Like William F. Buckley was useless overall.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying, is that like I am afraid of that. If you see that too. Like
the National Review used to be a publication that's primarily staffed by PhDs and intellectuals, and it used to do some good work in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. Since the 90s, since the late 90s, it's been taken over by people with nothing more than a BA who write popular bilge.
Did you watch the Jordan Peterson debate with Michael Eric Dyson? Did you see that clip?
No.
It's worth watching for this reason, because these are this. I mean, ostensibly Jordan Peterson was supposed to be our guy on that stage, but of course what happened is that Michael Eric Dyson, played the slave morality card, and it was Frame Games did a whole sort of commentary on this. His is probably better and more fun to watch, but at the end, Michael Eric Dyson's inviting Jordan Peterson to a black church, and Jordan Peterson's like, yeah, okay, I'll go, to virtue signal how open-minded and not racist he is. And it's like, okay, well, you just lost. Like, that's not effective at all, and there's no difference between these two guys as far as I can tell.
Jordan Peterson does a ton of good, and that he's not full-on alt-right. It's just suicidal and self-destructive for the alt-right to just continually, beat up on him. There are a lot of red pills that Jordan drops, and he's not, he's not our guy. He's not full-on our guy, but we have to appreciate the good things that people do, and not simply lambaste them for not living up to the level of purity that we would like.
It's very hard. Like, imagine if you had to do a debate with Michael Eric Dyson. That's an interesting situation, right? Because you're sort of saying you're just gonna have to take your lumps, kid. Like, you literally can't beat him in public because that's getting out of your lane. And it's like, yeah,
you can absolutely beat him in public. It depends on what your lane is. Like, I've created a lane where I can say things that 99% of the people can't say. Okay, I've worked really hard, and I've created a kingdom for myself in a lane where I can say things that most people can't say because I worked hard and created that.
Okay, that's fair. But like a lot of us can't, and so maybe you should invite Michael Eric Dyson on and put him in his place.
Dennis, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah, Eric Dyson and frickin' Jordan Peterson. And you're right, though. We should leave him alone because he's like a gateway drug. But they share premises, don't they? They share the premises, which is basically the secular liberal stuff that we kind of deplore. Just like before them, Buckley and say Gore Vidal shared the premises, and they were able to have their little discussions. Yeah. Basically, they had an understanding. No, we're talking about the best course for us, Western civilization, etc. We don't have that conversation anymore. These guys are, their shared premises are what, the pause almost. I think Peterson ultimately accepts, all of this nonsense. That we're supposed to be seeking, a tolerant, secular, humanist sort of society, right?
The way that I see it, like, I know what you're saying, Luke, because like Peterson will go on and he'll talk about differences between men and women or something. But at the end of the day, he's like, he actually reinforces liberal hegemony. And like, that's the enemy to me now. Man, you can't say that. I understand you can't say that, but it's like, it's hard.
Well, it's like conservatives who used to wail against political correctness. They created an opening that the alt-right poured through. So without conservatives beating up on political correctness, there wouldn't have been all these holes for the alt-right to pour through. So I say respect the good things that Jordan does, and
he's providing cover in a way. Maybe
he's providing openings that we don't even realize for more red pills to slip through, just as the conservative movement, by beating up on political correctness, paved the way for the success of the alt-right.
Okay.
Right, but past a certain point, though, it's sort of acquiescence. They're saying, yeah, they punched a bunch of holes. The sort of civic nationalist conservative critique punched a bunch of holes in PC, but they don't want to go any farther. And at some point, just reiterating these things, it almost becomes acquiescence. I agree with you, Luke, but I'm thinking that at some point, Jordan Peterson's acquiescence to the pause is a detriment. At some point he has to kind of shit or get off the pot.
I only listened to my first Jordan Peterson video this week, so
really?
To someone who's red pilled, you can live a very productive and happy life without tapping into Jordan Peterson. I've had no interest in Jordan Peterson. I've been forced to read articles about him because he's become this phenom. Right. And so when I do that, I see, okay, there are some good things he's doing, just like I prefer to think about the good things that people do in my life rather than all the ways that, they're letting me down or they're not as pure as I want. I just, concentrate on the positive. I never thought for a second that he was a thought leader for me.
There was a big article in the New York Times about these people, the IDW, the intellectual dark web.
Wasn't it repulsive?
I didn't read that. Is that any good?
Yeah,
it was just vomit. It just makes you want to vomit.
And how about the photography?
They're so gay.
They're so gay. They had first of all, it's Claire Lehman and Dave Rubin and Sam Harris and who am I missing? And then like the token goy is Jordan Peterson, and we're supposed to believe these are like the rebellious, like these people are beyond the bounds of right wing. That was the way that it was presented to us, and it's like it's bad. It's like, and so I see people as like kind of traitorously cooperate. If you're willing to let the New York Times take your picture standing in a vineyard, I mean, I'm not into it.
I always tell myself I'd never sit for those. If I was one of those guys, I would never sit for those concept shots. Here, hold your shotgun up. Let us take a picture of that.
Yeah.
There's a stream of thought in Orthodox Judaism and in Native American thought that when you let someone take your picture, that you're allowing them to take part of your soul. I don't think that perspective is entirely absurd.
I've thought of that before.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, look at all these Instagram celebrity girls losing their souls.
I don't like looking at the camera lens ever. That does creep me out a little bit. Making eye contact.
Okay, guys, I need to eat my Halo Top ice cream, and it's been great streaming with you, gentlemen. I wish. What's that song, "Nearer My God to Thee," that they were playing when the Titanic was going down? Remember? Did you guys see the movie Titanic?
Yeah, I don't remember how the song goes, but yeah,
we're the Titanic now.
That's where we are.
That's where we are. I mean, you may not realize that, but I just want to echo what was said in the movie Titanic, where the one musician turns to the other musician on the deck of the Titanic as it's turning into the crater and says, "Gentlemen, it's been the greatest honor of my life playing music with you." And then the theme swells up, "Nearer my God to thee, nearer to thee."
Yeah,
that's all my song shall be, nearer my God to thee. I think there's no better way to end.
Yes.
Amen.
Amen.
Though like the wanderer, the sun gone down, darkness be over me, my rest a stone. Yet in my dreams I'd be nearer my God to thee. Gentlemen, there's no one I'd rather be streaming with than you. It's been the greatest honor of my life to stream with you. And bye-bye.
Bye-bye.